This is The Lovers of Dark Humor. Written by #Blink and Thomas Sheriff, and read for you by Mike. Lovers of Dark Humor. A horror novel. Chapter 1. Samuel had always been attracted to dark humor. The kind of humor that made people uncomfortable, the kind of jokes that made people cringe. He loved finding ways to make people squirm with laughter and cringe with discomfort all at the same time. One day, he met a group of people who shared his love for dark humor. They called themselves the Lovers of Dark Humor, and they quickly became Samuel's closest friends. They spent hours brainstorming new jokes and ways to push the limits of what was socially acceptable. As time went on, however, Samuel began to notice that the group's humor was becoming more and more twisted. They started making jokes about death, murder, and torture. Samuel couldn't deny that the jokes made him uncomfortable, but he didn't want to be the outsider who couldn't handle it. One night, the group decided to take their humor to the next level. They planned to break into an abandoned mental institution and stage a mock murder for their own amusement. Samuel had some reservations, but ultimately he went along with it. As they crept through the dark, decrepit halls of the abandoned building, Samuel began to feel a sense of dread wash over him. He tried to shake it off, but the feeling only grew stronger as they set up their fake crime scene. Just as they were about to start the joke, something in the darkness caught Samuel's eye. He turned his flashlight towards the source of the movement and was frozen with fear. There, in the corner of the room, was a pair of glowing red eyes staring back at him. And they weren't laughing. Chapter 2. Samuel's heart was racing as he stood frozen in fear, staring at the glowing red eyes. His friends stood behind him, unaware of the presence lurking in the darkness. As the eyes moved closer, Samuel's fear turned to terror. They were not human eyes, they were too large and too bright. He tried to run, but his legs felt heavy as if rooted to the ground. The eyes were upon him now, and Samuel could feel their gaze piercing into his soul. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The eyes seemed to be drawing him in, capturing him in their hypnotic trance. Suddenly, Samuel felt a sharp pain in his shoulder. He turned around to see one of his friends holding a tranquilizer dart gun. The others had subdued him, and he slumped to the ground unconscious. When he woke up, Samuel found himself locked in a small room. His friends were nowhere to be seen, and he could hear strange noises coming from the walls. The room was cold and damp, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. As he lay there, trying to make sense of what had happened, Samuel realized that his love for dark humor had led him down a path of madness. His friends had taken it too far, and now he was paying the price. But it was too late. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making, and there was no way out. The Lovers of Dark Humor had claimed another victim, and Samuel knew he would never escape their twisted grasp. Chapter 3. As Samuel lay awake in his dark, damp cell, he heard a sudden scratching noise at the door. His heart racing, he tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination. But the scratching grew louder and more insistent, until there was no denying that something was trying to get in. Samuel scrambled to his feet and pressed himself against the far wall, his eyes glued to the door. He could see nothing through the narrow gap beneath it, but he could hear heaving breaths. The sound was not human, it was deep and guttural, like some monstrous animal. As the scratching grew louder, the door began to buckle under the force of whatever was trying to break through. Samuel felt his heart racing, his breath coming in short gasps. He had no idea what was on the other side, but he knew it was not something he wanted to face alone. Just as the door was about to give way, Samuel heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside. He let out a brief cry for help, relieved to know that his friends were still nearby. But as the footsteps drew nearer, Samuel realized with mounting horror that they were not the footsteps of his friends. With a terrible crashing sound, the door finally gave way, and Samuel was confronted by a horrifying figure. It was not human, it was a creature of nightmare, with scales like armor and eyes that glowed with an otherworldly light. Samuel felt his knees buckle as he realized just how far his love of dark humor had taken him, and how little he knew about the true depths of madness. Chapter 4. Samuel's heart pounded as the creature lunged at him. It had fur protruding from its grotesque body, and its eyes were a deep crimson. Samuel tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. It was as if all the dark humor he had once found amusing had been sucked out of him. The creature moved closer to him, and Samuel could smell the stench of its breath. The creature's teeth were jagged and menacing, and dripped with saliva as it snarled. Samuel struggled against the restraints that held him in place, but to no avail. The creature leaned in, ready to strike, and Samuel could see the hatred in its eyes. Suddenly, Samuel heard a voice in his head. It was a voice he recognized, one of his friends, who had planned the mock murder. "Samuel, it's not real. We're playing a joke on you. Just stay calm and we'll let you out soon." Relief flooded Samuel, but it quickly turned to anger. He had been locked up and terrorized for their sick amusement. He screamed and thrashed, but his voice was hoarse and his body weak from the tranquilizer. He knew he had to escape, to get away from these twisted individuals who had once been his friends. Samuel didn't know how long he was trapped in that room, but when they finally released him, he knew he would never be the same. The darkness that had once been humorous now brought him only fear and disgust. And the memory of those glowing red eyes would haunt him for the rest of his life. Chapter 5. Samuel stumbled out of the abandoned mental institution, his body shaking with terror. He had thought the creature in his cell was real, but it was just another twisted joke from his friends. The realization of how far they had gone with their dark humor hit him like a ton of bricks. He walked for hours, trying to shake off the feeling of being hunted by a monster. As the sun began to rise, he found himself in a small town, the streets empty and quiet. He saw a church and wandered inside, hoping to find some solace. The stained glass windows cast colorful patterns on the wooden pews as Samuel sat down, searching for some kind of meaning in his life. He thought about how his love for dark humor had led him down a path of madness, and how he had lost sight of what was real. He felt a deep sense of shame for his actions, and wondered how he could ever face his friends again. As the morning sun rose higher in the sky, Samuel knew he had to confront his friends and tell them how he felt. He walked back to the abandoned mental institution, his heart pounding as he approached the entrance. His friends were waiting for him, looking sheepish and guilty. They apologized profusely, telling him they had never meant to scare him so badly. They said they had gotten carried away with their dark humor, and promised never to go that far again. Samuel listened quietly, feeling a mixture of anger and relief. He knew he had to forgive them, but he also knew he could never go back to the way things were before. The experience had changed him, and he realized that dark humor wasn't worth sacrificing his sanity and self-respect. As he walked away from the mental institution and his former friends, Samuel felt a sense of freedom and clarity. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready to face it with a new perspective and a newfound appreciation for the light. Chapter 6. But even after leaving his old life behind, Samuel couldn't escape the memory of those glowing red eyes and the deep guttural breathing that had haunted him. Every night he would dream about the creature that his friends had tricked him into believing was real, and every morning he would wake up in a cold sweat. He tried to distract himself with work and parties and new friends, but nothing seemed to make the nightmares go away. His old group of friends would occasionally reach out to him, but he couldn't bring himself to talk to them, let alone forgive them for what they had done. One day, Samuel received a mysterious invitation in the mail. It was from his old group of friends, and it asked him to meet them at the abandoned mental institution where they had played their sick joke on him. Samuel was hesitant, but something compelled him to go. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was a desire for closure. Either way, he found himself walking through the dark halls of the asylum once again, heart pounding in his chest. When he arrived at the designated meeting spot, he found his old friends standing in a circle, looking down at something in the center. As he approached them, he realized with horror that it was a body. It was one of their own, a member of the group who had disappeared a few months ago. There was blood everywhere, and the stench of death filled the air. Samuel stumbled back, trying to escape the nightmare that was unfolding before him, but his friends grabbed him and pulled him back into the circle. "We did this for you, Samuel," one of them said with a sick grin. "We wanted to give you a real scare this time." Samuel realized then that his friends weren't just lovers of dark humor. They were psychopaths, capable of unspeakable acts of violence. And he was trapped with them, in the same abandoned building where his nightmare had begun. The creature with the glowing red eyes wasn't real, but the horror that his friends were capable of was all too real. And there was no escaping it this time. Chapter 7. Samuel hesitated before accepting the invitation from his old friends. His past experience with them had left him traumatized, and he was unsure if he was ready to face them again. However, he was also curious to find out what they were up to now. As he approached the abandoned mental institution, a feeling of dread washed over him. Memories of the creature they had used to scare him flooded his mind, and his heart rate increased. His friends greeted him with enthusiasm, and welcomed him back into their group. They seemed to have changed since the last time he saw them, but he couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. They led him deep into the bowels of the building, where they revealed their latest twisted plan. They had set up a series of traps and obstacles throughout the institution, challenging each other to see who could make it out alive. Samuel tried to back out, but they wouldn't let him leave. Soon, he found himself trapped in a dark, twisted game of survival. He navigated through the maze of traps, dodging deadly projectiles and avoiding pitfalls. Every time he made it past an obstacle, his friends would cheer, but he couldn't shake off the feeling that they were enjoying his suffering. As he neared the end of the game, Samuel realized that his friends had no intention of letting him leave the building alive. They had planned this all along, luring him back to the institution to use him as their latest victim. Samuel's love for dark humor had once again led him down a path of madness, and this time there was no turning back. Chapter 8. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as his eyes darted around the dark and musty corridor of the mental institution. He had come to this place with his friends, but he knew now that they were not his friends anymore. They were psychopaths who wanted to kill him in a twisted game of survival. "What do you want from me?" Samuel's voice trembled as he spoke. His former friends just laughed as they pulled out their weapons. One of them had a baseball bat, another had a knife, and the third had a chainsaw. "We want to play a game with you," the one with the chainsaw said. Samuel knew he had to escape before they cornered him. He looked around for a way out, and saw a door that led to the outside. He darted towards it and tried to open it, but it was locked. He turned around to see his former friends slowly advancing towards him with their weapons drawn. Samuel was trapped. Suddenly, he heard a loud growling coming from down the corridor. His former friends turned to see what it was, giving Samuel an opportunity to run the other way. The growling grew louder, and Samuel realized that it was coming from the creature that had terrorized him before. He could see its glowing red eyes in the darkness, and he knew that it was real this time. Samuel ran as fast as he could down the corridor, trying to put as much distance between himself and the creature as possible. His former friends followed behind, shouting and laughing as they chased him. Just when he thought he couldn't run anymore, Samuel saw a glimmer of light at the end of the corridor. It was the exit, and he knew that he was almost free. He ran towards the light and burst through the door, stumbling out into the bright sunlight. Samuel looked back to see his former friends trapped inside with the creature, and he knew that he had escaped just in time. But the memory of what he had experienced in that abandoned mental institution would haunt him for the rest of his life. Samuel had learned the hard way that there was a thin line between dark humor and true horror, and he vowed never to cross it again. Chapter 9. Samuel ran as fast as he could through the dark, damp hallways of the mental institution, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to keep moving to stay alive. He could hear his former friends' footsteps behind him, their manic laughter echoing through the empty halls. He knew they were getting closer, but he couldn't let them catch him. Suddenly, he heard a low growl coming from one of the rooms. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. But then he heard his friend's footsteps getting closer, and he knew he had to take his chances. He burst into the room and slammed the door shut behind him, hoping it would buy him some time. The room was pitch black, but he could feel something moving in the darkness. And then he saw them, the glowing red eyes. He realized with a growing sense of horror that the creature he had seen before was real, and it was in the same room as him. But then something strange happened. The creature didn't attack him. Instead, it seemed to be looking at him, studying him. And then it spoke, not in words but in images that appeared in Samuel's mind. It showed him visions of his friends, their twisted grins and gleeful laughter as they planned his demise. It showed him the extent of their depravity, their willingness to do anything for a sick joke. And then it showed him a way out. A secret passage that would lead him to safety. Samuel didn't hesitate. He followed the creature's instructions, navigating his way through the maze of tunnels, until he saw a glimmer of light in the distance. He ran towards it, his heart pounding with hope. And then he burst into the open air, gasping for breath. He looked back at the mental institution, knowing that his former friends were still in there waiting for him. But he also knew that he had something they didn't, the knowledge of their true nature and the power to expose them. He vowed to himself that he would do everything in his power to make sure they never hurt anyone again. As he walked away, he felt a sense of freedom and liberation. He had escaped the clutches of his former friends, and he had the knowledge to bring them to justice. But he also knew that he would never forget the creature that had helped him survive. And he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than just a random encounter in an abandoned mental institution. Chapter 10. Samuel followed the glowing red eyes that led him through the dark and eerie halls of the abandoned mental institution. He didn't know what to make of the creature that had saved him from his former friends, but he was grateful for its guidance. As they made their way through the maze of corridors, Samuel couldn't help but feel that something was off. The creature seemed to be leading him deeper into the bowels of the institution, away from the exit. Samuel tried to turn back, but the creature pushed him forward, its glowing red eyes seeming to urge him on. Samuel felt a growing sense of unease as they entered a dark and desolate room at the end of a long hallway. The room was as silent as a tomb, and the only light came from the creature's eyes. Samuel could hear the sound of his own breathing and the pounding of his heart as he looked around. Suddenly, the air was filled with the sound of a low growl, and Samuel saw a humanoid figure emerge from the shadows. It was clad in tattered clothes, and its eyes glittered with a menacing light. Samuel was frozen with terror as the creature lunged at him, but the creature with the glowing red eyes leapt in front of him, and the two figures collided. For an instant Samuel thought he saw a blur of fur and teeth, and then the creature with the glowing red eyes was gone, leaving him alone with the snarling creature in tattered clothes. The creature advanced on Samuel, showing him its teeth, and Samuel knew he was in deep trouble. But something unexpected happened. The snarling creature faltered, and Samuel caught a glimpse of another pair of glowing red eyes, deeper in the shadows. Suddenly, the snarling creature turned and fled, and Samuel was left standing alone in the dark room, listening to the sound of his own breath. He didn't know what had just happened, but he had a sense that he was being watched by something far more frightening than the creature that had just attacked him. Chapter 11. Samuel's heart was pounding in his chest as he tried to catch his breath. He realized that the creature with the glowing red eyes had saved him once again, but he couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. He looked around the room, but saw nothing but darkness. Then he heard a faint whisper that sent chills down his spine. "Samuel," the voice said, "do you remember me?" It was a woman's voice, and Samuel recognized it as the voice of one of his former friends. He couldn't see her, but he knew she was somewhere in the darkness. Samuel tried to remain calm and focused, but his mind was clouded with fear and confusion. Who are you?" Samuel stuttered. The woman let out a low chuckle, and Samuel realized that he was in grave danger. He backed away slowly, trying to find an exit, but he was surrounded by darkness. "I'm the one you left behind, Samuel," the woman said. "The one you betrayed." Samuel's mind raced as he tried to remember who the woman was, but his memories were blurred. He couldn't recall leaving anyone behind. He thought he had simply distanced himself from his former friends. "I don't understand," Samuel said. "What are you talking about?" The woman stepped out of the darkness, revealing her face. Samuel gasped in horror when he saw her. She was covered in blood, and her eyes were filled with hatred. "You abandoned me, Samuel," she hissed. "You left me to die." Samuel felt a surge of guilt and fear wash over him. He remembered who the woman was. He had left her behind during a prank gone wrong. He had thought that she would catch up to them, but he later found out that she had been caught and locked up by the authorities. "I'm sorry," Samuel said, his voice shaking. "I didn't mean." But before he could finish his sentence, the woman lunged at him with a knife. Samuel dodged her attack and ran towards the exit. The creature with the glowing red eyes was waiting for him, and it led him to safety. Samuel vowed never to return to the abandoned mental institution or engage in dark humor again. He knew that the consequences of his actions could be deadly, and he had learned his lesson the hard way. Chapter 12. Samuel took a deep breath as he leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath. He had never been in such a terrifying situation before, and his heart was still racing. He looked around, but the creature with the glowing red eyes was nowhere to be seen. As he stood there, he realized that he had no idea where he was or how to get out of the mental institution. He cursed himself for going along with his former friends' twisted game of survival. He should have known better than to trust them. Suddenly, he heard a rustling noise behind him. He spun around, ready to face whatever was coming at him. But instead of a monster, he found himself face to face with a door. Samuel cautiously pushed the door open, hoping to find a way out. But as he stepped into the room, he realized that he had made a terrible mistake. The room was filled with bodies, some fresh, some decomposing. The stench was overpowering, and Samuel felt his stomach turn. He tried to run back to the door, but it slammed shut on its own, trapping him inside. He heard footsteps approaching, and his heart sank. He was trapped in a room filled with corpses, with no way out. He was going to die here, alone and terrified. But then, he saw the glowing red eyes again. The creature had returned. Samuel watched, frozen with fear, as it approached him. But instead of attacking him, the creature held out a hand. Samuel hesitated for a moment, but then reached out and took it. The creature led Samuel through a twisting maze of abandoned hallways and rooms, until finally they emerged outside. Samuel stumbled out into the daylight, gasping for air and blinking in the bright sunlight. He looked up at the creature with the glowing red eyes, unsure of what to do or say. But before he could speak, the creature vanished, leaving Samuel alone in the world once again. He knew that he would never forget the horror of that night, but he also knew that he had been given a second chance. A chance to start over, to leave his former life behind and find a new path. And for that, Samuel was grateful to the creature with the glowing red eyes. Chapter 13. Samuel stumbled out of the mental institution, unsure of how much time had passed since he had been trapped inside. He looked around and realized that he was in the middle of the woods, with no sign of civilization in sight. He was relieved to be out of the mental institution, but had no idea where to go next. As he walked through the dense forest, Samuel felt a sense of unease wash over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, and every snap of a twig or rustle in the bushes made him jump. The only comfort he had was the memory of the creature with the glowing red eyes, who had saved him time and time again. Suddenly, Samuel heard a voice from behind him. "Hello, Samuel," it said. He turned around to see the creature with the glowing red eyes, standing just a few feet away. "I'm glad to see you made it out safely." Samuel breathed a sigh of relief and tried to thank the creature, but it interrupted him. "I'm afraid I have some bad news," it said. "Your former friends, The ones who dragged you into their twisted world of dark humor are still out there. And they want revenge. Samuel's heart sank. He had hoped that he could leave his past behind, but it seemed that his former friends wouldn't let him go that easily. "What do I do?" he asked the creature. "You must stay hidden," it replied. "They will be looking for you, but if you can stay out of sight, I will do my best to protect you." Samuel nodded, feeling grateful for the creature's help. But as he set off into the woods, he knew that he was in for a long and dangerous journey. He didn't know what would become of him or where he would end up, but he was determined to stay alive and start anew. Chapter 14. Samuel stumbled through the dark forest, his heart thundering in his chest as he braced himself against the gnarled trees. The creature with glowing red eyes had vanished, leaving him alone to navigate the tangled underbrush. He couldn't trust anyone anymore, not even the strange creature who had saved his life more than once. His former friends had shown him how twisted and cruel they could be, and he wondered how many others shared their morbid sense of humor. Were there others lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce on unsuspecting victims like himself? As he stumbled through the woods, Samuel heard the distinct sound of snapping twigs behind him. Fear surged through him like a wave, and he spun around, expecting to see one of his pursuers. But there was nothing there, only the rustling of leaves and the hoot of an owl in the distance. He pressed on, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. But the forest was eerily quiet, and he realized with a sinking feeling that he was completely alone. Hours passed, and Samuel grew weary and disoriented. He couldn't tell if he was moving in circles or making progress. The trees all looked the same, and the ground was littered with fallen leaves that muffled his footsteps. Just as he was about to give up hope, he saw a faint light in the distance. He stumbled towards it, his heart racing with anticipation. As he drew closer, he realized it was a cabin, nestled in a clearing. He approached cautiously, unsure if it was a trap or a safe haven. But as he got closer, he saw that the door was slightly ajar, and there was a flickering candlelight inside. With no other options, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The cabin was small and cramped, with a musty smell that made him wrinkle his nose. But it was warm and dry, and he collapsed onto the lumpy cot with a sigh of relief. As he drifted off to sleep, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from the shadows. But for now, he was safe. Chapter 15. Samuel's heart pounded with fear as he stepped inside the cabin, searching for a weapon to defend himself. It was empty, save for a single wooden chair and a dirty mattress on the floor. He took a deep breath and tried to calm his racing thoughts. As he sat down on the mattress, he heard a faint scratching sound coming from outside. Samuel crept towards the window and peered outside, but could see nothing in the darkness. The scratching grew louder, accompanied by a low growling noise. Suddenly, the window shattered and a large, hairy creature lunged through the opening. Samuel screamed and scrambled backwards, desperately trying to fend off the monster with his bare fists. The creature was relentless, slashing at him with sharp claws that left deep gashes in his flesh. Just as Samuel thought his life was over, the creature stopped attacking and backed away, allowing him to escape. Samuel stumbled out of the cabin, his wounds bleeding profusely, and collapsed in a clearing. The creature approached him, its eyes glowing in the darkness. Samuel could see now that it was some sort of werewolf, with a thick gray coat of fur and sharp teeth the size of his fingers. The creature gave a low growl, as if warning him to stay away. But Samuel knew that he was in danger, and he needed the werewolf's help to survive. "Please, I need your help," he gasped, his vision fading. The werewolf hesitated for a moment, then leaned down and sniffed at Samuel's wounds. To his surprise, the creature began to lick his wounds, its saliva somehow accelerating the healing process. Samuel watched in disbelief as his injuries closed up before his very eyes. The werewolf sat next to him, watching him intently. "I don't understand. Why are you helping me?" Samuel asked, still in shock. The werewolf gave a low growl, almost like a chuckle. "Because we have a common enemy," it replied. "Your former friends, the ones who hurt you. They are my enemy too." Samuel felt a glimmer of hope. Together, he and the werewolf could take on his psychopathic ex-friends. He had a new ally in the fight for his life. But first, he needed to rest and recover from his injuries. Samuel leaned against the werewolf, feeling a sense of safety for the first time since his nightmare had begun. Chapter 16. Samuel woke up to the sound of rain tapping against the cabin's roof. He stretched his sore limbs and looked around the room, half expecting the werewolf to be gone. But the creature was still there, sitting by the fireplace, looking at him with its amber eyes. "Morning," the werewolf said, breaking the awkward silence. "Morning," Samuel replied, feeling grateful for the creature's help but still uneasy about its presence. "I hope you don't mind, I helped myself to some of your food," the werewolf said, indicating the empty plate on the table. Samuel shook his head. "No, it's fine. Thank you." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain outside. Samuel couldn't help but wonder how he got himself into this mess. He never thought his love for dark humor would lead him to this. He missed his old life, his old friends, but he knew he could never go back now. "I heard some noises outside earlier," the werewolf said, breaking the silence once more. "I think your friends might have found us." Samuel's heart raced. "What do we do?" The werewolf stood up, towering over Samuel. "We stay here and wait. If they come, we'll fight." Samuel wasn't sure if he wanted to fight his former friends, but he knew he had no other choice. He nodded at the werewolf, feeling a slight sense of relief knowing he wasn't alone in this. They sat in silence once again, waiting for their fate. Samuel couldn't help but think about his old friends, and what they had become. He used to think their dark humor was harmless, but now he saw the sinister side of it. He couldn't believe he used to be a part of it. The sound of footsteps outside broke their silence. Samuel's heart raced as he reached for a nearby weapon, but the werewolf raised its hand, signaling him to stop. The door creaked open, and Samuel's former friends stepped inside, looking around the room with smirks on their faces. "Long time no see, Samuel," one of them said, pulling out a knife. "We've missed you." Samuel tightened his grip around his weapon, as the werewolf growled, ready to fight. The rain tapped against the cabin's roof, creating a rhythmic beat that seemed to match their heartbeats. Samuel wondered who would come out alive. Chapter 17. Samuel's former friends burst through the cabin door, their faces twisted with anger and hatred. They had come to finish what they had started, to take Samuel's life in a twisted game of survival. But Samuel was not alone. The werewolf stood tall beside him, its fur bristling and its teeth bared in a feral grin. Samuel had never seen anything like it before, but he knew that he could trust the creature. Together, they would fight to survive. The room erupted into chaos as the werewolf charged at Samuel's former friends, knocking them to the ground with a ferocious growl. Samuel darted around the room, searching for a weapon to defend himself. He spotted an old wooden chair and lifted it high above his head, ready to strike. But before he could bring it down on the head of one of his attackers, a hand reached out and grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the fight. It was the creature with glowing red eyes. Samuel had almost forgotten about his warning, but now he knew that it had been right. His former friends were dangerous, and he needed to stay out of their way if he wanted to survive. "Come with me," the creature said, leading Samuel to a hidden trapdoor in the floor. "There's a way out of here." Samuel followed the creature down into a dimly lit tunnel. The air was damp and musty, and the sound of dripping water echoed all around them. But there was a sense of safety in the darkness, away from the chaos and danger of the cabin above. As they made their way through the tunnel, Samuel couldn't help but wonder who the creature was and why it was helping him. But he knew that he had no choice but to trust it. His former friends were still out there, and they would stop at nothing to take his life. Finally, they emerged from the tunnel into the fresh night air. Samuel looked around, disoriented and uncertain of his next move. But the creature with glowing red eyes seemed to know where they were going. It led him deeper into the woods, away from the danger and toward a new kind of darkness. Samuel shuddered as they walked, uncertain of what lay ahead. But he knew that he would follow the creature to the ends of the earth if it meant staying alive. Together, they would face whatever horrors lay ahead, and they would emerge victorious. Chapter 18. As Samuel and the werewolf ran through the dark woods, Samuel couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude towards the creature that had saved his life. He had never expected to ally himself with a werewolf, but he knew that in this twisted game of survival, they needed all the help they could get. The rain pelted down on them, making it difficult to see in the pitch-black darkness. The only light came from the occasional flash of lightning that lit up the sky. Samuel stumbled over rocks and tree roots, his heart pounding in his chest. The werewolf ran in front of him, leading the way with an effortless grace that Samuel couldn't help but envy. In the dim light, he couldn't see the creature's eyes, but he felt its presence beside him, a reassuring presence in this terrifying world. They had been running for what felt like hours, when they finally stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a dilapidated old house, its windows boarded up and its roof caving in. The werewolf led Samuel inside, and they hunkered down in a corner waiting for the storm to pass. As they waited, Samuel couldn't help but think about his former friends, and what had driven them to become so twisted. He had always loved dark humor, but he had never thought it would lead to something like this. He couldn't help but feel guilty for his role in everything that had happened. But as he looked over at the werewolf, he knew that they had a chance to make things right. They may be hunted and terrified, but Samuel had found an ally in this strange creature, and together they were stronger than they could have ever imagined. The storm raged on outside, but inside the old house, Samuel and the werewolf waited, ready to face whatever terror came their way. Chapter 19. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the forest damp and the air thick with the smell of wet leaves. Samuel and the werewolf had spent the night in the old house, unsure of what the morning would bring. They sat in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from upstairs. Samuel and the werewolf jumped to their feet, ready for whatever was coming their way. But when they climbed the stairs, they found something unexpected. One of Samuel's former friends lay sprawled on the floor, tangled up in a blanket and surrounded by broken pieces of furniture. He looked up at Samuel and the werewolf with a sheepish grin. "I was trying to sneak up on you guys, but I tripped over my own feet," he said, trying to suppress a laugh. Samuel couldn't help but chuckle. It was a relief to have a moment of levity in the midst of all this chaos. The werewolf, however, wasn't amused. "You shouldn't be here," he growled. "You're not welcome." Samuel's former friend shrugged. I know. But I couldn't resist. Besides, I wanted to see if you were okay after all that craziness last night." Samuel sighed. "We're fine," he said. "But please just leave us alone. We don't want any more trouble." His former friend nodded, looking suddenly serious. "I understand. I'll go. But just remember, Samuel, we're still watching you. And we'll be back." With that, he slipped out of the house and into the woods, leaving Samuel and the werewolf alone once again. Samuel wiped his forehead, feeling relieved that the situation hadn't escalated further. He turned to the werewolf and grinned. "Well," he said, "that was unexpected." The werewolf snorted. "Tell me about it. I never thought I'd be sharing a house with a human, let alone finding him funny." Samuel laughed. Who knows what other surprises this adventure will bring? As they settled back into the dusty old house, Samuel felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to survive this game with the help of his unlikely ally. Chapter 20. Samuel and the werewolf remained on high alert, knowing they were still being watched. They searched the old house for any signs of their pursuers but found nothing. The rain had stopped, and the sun was beginning to rise, casting a faint light through the windows. As they sat in the living room, Samuel began to question his own sanity. Could all of this really be happening? Were his former friends really monsters, or was it all in his head? The werewolf sensed his doubt and spoke up. "I know it's hard to believe, Samuel, but what you saw back there was real. Your friends have been taken over by something dark and dangerous. We need to find a way to stop them before they hurt anyone else." Samuel nodded, knowing deep down that the werewolf was right. They needed to find a way to end this nightmare once and for all. As they continued their search, Samuel stumbled upon a hidden room behind a bookshelf. Inside, he found a dusty old journal written by the previous owner of the house. The journal contained detailed accounts of strange occurrences and supernatural sightings in the area. Samuel began to read through the journal, looking for any clues that could help them defeat their enemies. As he read, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Suddenly, the room began to shake, and the walls creaked and groaned as if they were alive. Samuel and the werewolf looked at each other, knowing that their time was running out. They needed to act fast before it was too late. Chapter 21. Samuel and the werewolf hastily gathered their things and bolted out of the old house, not waiting to find out what had caused the tremors. They ran through the woods with the werewolf leading the way with an otherworldly grace. After a while, they came across a clearing where they saw a strange sight. In the middle of the clearing, surrounded by a circle of animals, was a figure dressed in dark robes. The animals seemed to be watching the figure intently, as it chanted and performed a ritual with strange objects. Samuel and the werewolf hid behind a tree and watched in awe as the figure continued with its ritual. Suddenly, one of the animals, a fox, broke the circle and started running towards them. It stopped in front of them and looked at them with intelligent eyes. Samuel and the werewolf were transfixed, wondering what the creature wanted from them. The fox opened its mouth and spoke in a language that Samuel and the werewolf didn't understand. Samuel and the werewolf stared at each other in disbelief. The fox had just spoken to them. As they were trying to come to grips with what had just happened, the circle of animals broke and they scattered in all directions. The figure in the dark robes turned towards them and started running in their direction. Samuel and the werewolf took off, sprinting in the other direction, their hearts racing with fear. As they ran, they heard the figure's footsteps getting closer and closer. Just as they were about to give up, they saw a cabin in the distance. They ran towards it and slammed the door shut behind them, panting with exhaustion. The cabin was dark, and they couldn't see anything, but they could hear the figure getting closer. They waited in silence until they heard the figure move on. As they waited, the cabin was filled with the sound of animal noises, as if the spirits of the animals from the clearing had followed them and were now watching them from the shadows. Samuel and the werewolf knew that they had to leave the cabin and continue their journey, but the thought of what lay outside was almost too much to bear. They huddled together, waiting for the courage to face what lay beyond the door. Chapter 22. Samuel's heart was pounding as he and the werewolf crouched behind a chair. The animal noises outside grew louder, and they could hear footsteps coming closer. Samuel couldn't believe his luck. First, he had stumbled upon a group of friends who shared his love for dark humor, and now he was fighting for his life against an unknown enemy. He looked at the werewolf in the dim light of the cabin, and wondered if he could trust him. They had only just met, but they had already been through so much together. Samuel decided to take a chance and whispered, "Do you have any idea what's going on?" The werewolf shook his head. "No, but I have a feeling we're not going to like it." Suddenly, there was a loud noise outside and something crashed into the cabin. Samuel and the werewolf ducked down, trying to remain hidden. They could hear voices outside, but they were too far away to make out what was being said. After what felt like hours, the noises outside began to die down. Samuel and the werewolf cautiously peeked out of the windows. They saw nothing but trees and darkness. The silence was eerie, and Samuel found himself holding his breath. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Samuel and the werewolf looked at each other, terrified. They had no idea who or what was on the other side of the door. Samuel hesitated for a moment before slowly making his way to the door. He reached for the handle, his hand shaking. Taking a deep breath, he opened the door. On the other side stood a man with a sinister grin on his face. "Hello, boys," he said. "Welcome to the game." Samuel felt a cold sweat run down his back. The game? What game? And who was this man? But before he could ask any questions, the man stepped inside the cabin and shut the door behind him. The room grew even darker, and Samuel could barely make out the man's features. "Let me guess," the man said, still grinning. "You're wondering what's going on?" Samuel nodded, too scared to speak. "Well," the man continued, "I'll tell you what's going on. You've stumbled into a game, boys. And in this game there are no rules." Chapter 23. The man with the sinister grin sauntered into the cabin, his eyes flickering with malevolent delight. "I see you found my game," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. His gaze swept over Samuel and the werewolf, appraising them, calculating. "I must say I'm impressed." Samuel's heart hammered in his chest as he took a step back, his mind racing for an escape plan. But the man with the sinister grin seemed to anticipate his every move, blocking him at every turn. "What do you want from us?" Samuel demanded, hoping to buy some time. The man smirked, his eyes glinting. "I want to play a little game. You see, I've been watching you, Samuel. Watching you and your little group. You all think you're so clever, with your dark humor, your twisted jokes. But you don't know the first thing about true darkness. And I want to show you." As he spoke, the man pulled out a deck of cards and began to shuffle them expertly. "Now you have a choice," he said, holding out the deck. "You can play my game or you can die. It's that simple." Samuel and the werewolf exchanged a look, both of them knowing that they had little choice but to play along. Gritting his teeth, Samuel reached out and drew a card from the deck. It was the Ace of Spades. The man with the sinister grin chuckled. "Ah, the Ace of Spades. How fitting. You see, that means you get to go first. And your task is simple. You just have to survive." With those words, the man disappeared into the darkness, leaving Samuel and the werewolf alone to face whatever horrors lay ahead. Samuel gripped his card tightly, his mind reeling with fear and uncertainty. What kind of twisted game had they stumbled into? And could they make it out alive? Chapter 24. Samuel and the werewolf looked at each other, unsure of what to make of the man's challenge. The silence was broken by a low growl coming from the werewolf's throat, signaling his unease. Suddenly the cabin door burst open, and a group of hooded figures entered, wielding knives and chains. Samuel and the werewolf leapt to their feet, ready to defend themselves. The group of attackers circled around them, cackling with twisted delight. Their eyes glinted with an otherworldly fervor, and their laughter sounded like a chorus of demons. Samuel and the werewolf fought back with everything they had, but the attackers were relentless. They seemed to be enjoying the violence, their movements swift and graceful as they dodged and weaved around the room. Samuel watched in horror as the werewolf was overpowered by one of the attackers, who plunged a knife into his side. The werewolf let out a howl of agony and fell to the ground, writhing in pain. Samuel was filled with a fierce rage, fueled by his love for his friend, and he fought harder than ever. With a strength he didn't know he possessed, he tackled one of the attackers to the ground and reached for the knife that had fallen from the assailant's hand. As he raised the knife to strike, he caught sight of his reflection in a nearby mirror. What he saw made him freeze in horror. His eyes glowed with the same eerie red light he had seen in the abandoned mental institution. He realized with a sickening certainty that he had been changed by the creature that had saved him. With a sob of despair, he dropped the knife and stumbled back from the attackers. They closed in on him, their knives glinting in the dim light. Samuel knew he was doomed. But he refused to give up without a fight. He raised his fists and braced himself for the final attack, ready to face whatever horrors awaited him. Chapter 25. Samuel tried to run, to flee from the hooded figures that were chasing him. His heart raced in his chest as he heard their footsteps getting closer and closer. He didn't know where he was going, he was just running blindly through the trees. He could feel the sharp branches and twigs scratching his skin as he ran through the undergrowth. Finally he came to a clearing, and he saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. In the center of the clearing, there was a woman. She was sitting on the ground with her knees pulled up to her chest, and she seemed to be staring off into the distance. What caught Samuel's attention, however, was the fact that she was not wearing a hooded robe like the others. Instead, she was dressed in a simple white dress that was stained with blood. Her hair was a tangled mess, and her eyes were dark and hollow. Samuel hesitated for a moment, unsure if he could trust her. But he could hear the hooded figures closing in on him, and he knew he didn't have much time. "Please help me," he gasped out, running towards her. "They're trying to kill me." The woman only looked up at him with a blank expression. She didn't seem to react to his words at all. But when the hooded figures burst into the clearing, she stood up and revealed the knife she had been hiding behind her back. In a flash she was upon them, slashing and cutting with a ferocity that Samuel had never seen before. The hooded figures fell back, surprised by this sudden attack. Samuel could see that they were hesitating, unsure of how to react to this new threat. It was then that Samuel realized that this woman was not like anyone he had ever met before. There was something in her eyes that told him she was not entirely human. Before he could process that thought, she grabbed his hand and pulled him towards the edge of the clearing. They ran together through the trees, the sound of the hooded figure's screams echoing behind them. As they ran, Samuel could feel something changing in him. He could feel a darkness creeping into his soul, a darkness that he knew he could never escape from. And he knew that this woman was the only one who could guide him through it. He didn't know where they were going, but he knew that he couldn't go back to his old life. Not after what he had seen. Not after what he had become. But he was ready to embrace the darkness. And he knew that with her by his side, he could survive anything. Chapter 26. Samuel and the woman, whose name he still did not know, continued to run through the forest, their adrenaline pumping with each step. Samuel could hear the hooded figures pursuing them, their angry shouts echoing through the trees. As they burst into a small clearing, Samuel's heart plummeted at the sight of a large, ominous structure towering before them. It was an old abandoned church, its stonework covered in moss and ivy. The woman stopped and turned to him, a sinister glint in her eye. "Don't worry, my love," she purred. "We'll be safe here." Samuel hesitated, feeling unease at the prospect of entering such a foreboding place. But the sounds of the hooded figures getting closer spurred him on. They ran inside, the woman leading the way. The inside of the church was even more unsettling than the outside. The air was damp and musty, and the only light came from a few flickering candles scattered around the room. Samuel could feel his heart pounding as the woman led him deeper into the building. They came to a large room where the woman suddenly stopped. Samuel looked around, trying to see what had caught her attention. That's when he saw it. In the center of the room, there was a large, ornate coffin. Samuel felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He had a feeling he knew what was inside that coffin. The woman approached it slowly, a wicked smile spreading across her face. Samuel tried to back away, but she was too quick. She grabbed him by the arm, pulling him towards the coffin. Suddenly, the lid creaked open, revealing the contents inside. Samuel's worst fears were realized as the hooded figures burst into the room, their eyes alight with madness and hatred. Samuel tried to run, but the woman held him back, whispering in his ear. "Welcome to your new life, my love," she said, as the hooded figures closed in on them. Chapter 27. As Samuel adjusted to his new life with the mysterious woman, he found himself enjoying the lighter side of darkness. They spent their nights exploring abandoned buildings and scaring each other with harmless pranks. Samuel found himself laughing more than he had in years. One night, they stumbled upon an old amusement park that had been closed for years. They broke in and rode the rusted roller coasters and ate cotton candy under the moonlight. For the first time in a long time, Samuel felt truly happy. As they were leaving, they noticed a group of teenagers sneaking in. Samuel and the woman watched from a distance as the teens tried to scare each other with ghost stories. The woman had an idea. She transformed into a ghostly apparition and floated towards the teens, causing them to scream and run away in terror. Samuel and the woman laughed as they walked away, feeling satisfied with their night's amusement. As they made their way back to the abandoned church, Samuel felt a sense of belonging with the woman. He knew that he had finally found his true love, even if it was in the darkness. But as they reached the church, they discovered that they were not alone. The hooded figures had returned, and they had brought reinforcements. Samuel and the woman braced themselves for a fight, but instead, the hooded figures simply watched them with curiosity. One of the figures stepped forward and removed their hood, revealing a friendly face. It was a member of Samuel's old dark humor group, who he thought had disappeared years ago. The former friends reunited and shared stories, realizing that they had all found different paths to the darkness they craved. As the night wore on, they decided to play a game of hide-and-seek in the church. It was a game that brought them all back to a simpler time, before the darkness had consumed them. For just one night, they could be lovers of dark humor without the terrors that had come with it. But as the game came to an end and they said their goodbyes, Samuel knew that the darkness would always call to him. He had found a community that understood him and accepted him, but he also knew that he would always be drawn to the thrill of the unknown. The hooded figures disappeared into the night, leaving Samuel and the woman alone once again. They lay in each other's arms, watching the stars twinkle through the broken church windows. Samuel knew that he had found his home in the darkness, but he also knew that the darkness would always be his greatest struggle. Chapter 28. Samuel and his mysterious companion explored the abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. The thrill of danger and the unknown kept them alive, their laughter ringing through the empty park as they rode the rusted rides and played old games. They even found a decrepit carnival tent, complete with twisted clowns and freaks. Samuel couldn't help but feel a flicker of unease at the sight of the distorted faces, but his companion simply laughed it off. As they walked through the darkened carnival grounds, a sudden rustling caught their attention. Samuel's companion tensed, her eyes darting around for the source of the noise. Suddenly a figure emerged from the shadows, hooded and masked. Samuel felt a chill run down his spine, as he recognized the figure from the night he had escaped the mental institution. The figure made a high-pitched whine, and Samuel's companion seemed to understand. She turned to Samuel, her voice a low growl. "They're after you, Samuel. You must stay hidden." Samuel nodded, feeling the darkness within him stirring. He watched as his companion launched herself at the hooded figure, the two grappling fiercely in a blur of movement. Samuel realized with a start that his companion was a supernatural being herself, and he felt a sudden surge of power within him. The battle was over quickly, with the hooded figure lying motionless on the ground. Samuel's companion turned to him, her eyes glowing in the darkness. "You must embrace your true nature, Samuel. Only then will you be safe." Samuel knew she was right. He had been running from his darkness for too long, and it was time to face it head-on. With a newfound sense of purpose, he followed his companion into the night, ready to embrace the darkness within. But as they disappeared into the shadows, Samuel couldn't help but wonder what other horrors lay in wait for him. Chapter 29. Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched as they continued to explore the abandoned amusement park. His companion was at ease but urged him to trust her instincts. They walked through the carnival games, stepping over broken glass and abandoned toys. Suddenly, a clown statue caught Samuel's attention, and he froze. His companion noticed his hesitation, and turned to see what had frightened him. She scoffed. "It's just a statue," she said. But as they walked closer, they realized that it wasn't just a statue. The clown's eyes followed them, and they could hear a faint laughter. Samuel's companion started to back away, but Samuel, entranced, walked towards the clown. As he approached, the clown's face morphed, contorting into a grotesque shape. Samuel realized it was no ordinary clown, but an entity of the darkness. Its laughter grew louder as the hooded figures emerged from the shadows, surrounding them. Samuel's companion grabbed his hand, and together they ran. They weaved in and out of abandoned rides, dodging the hooded figures as they chased them. They thought they had lost them, only to find themselves cornered in a dark alleyway. The hooded figures closed in on them, their eyes glowing with anticipation. But just as they were about to strike, Samuel's companion unleashed a wave of dark energy that sent the hooded figures flying. The entity of the darkness, the clown, disappeared, and the amusement park was silent once more. Shaken but relieved, Samuel and his companion walked away from the abandoned amusement park. Samuel realized that he had never truly been alone since he had stumbled upon his companion. He had found his place in the darkness, and he was ready to embrace it fully. Chapter 30. Samuel and his companion spent months exploring abandoned places, but as time went on, Samuel realized that the darkness was no longer consuming him. He found himself laughing more and enjoying the company of others, even those outside his little circle of dark humor friends. One day, Samuel and his companion stumbled upon a small-town fair. Samuel was hesitant at first, but his companion urged him to give it a chance. As they walked around the fairgrounds, Samuel found himself smiling at the bright colors of the carnival games and the happy screams of the children on the rides. They stopped at a food stand and bought a bag of cotton candy to share. As they sat on a bench and watched the people go by, Samuel felt a sense of lightness that he had never experienced before. He realized that he didn't always have to be surrounded by darkness to find happiness. As they left the fair, Samuel and his companion walked hand in hand. They talked and laughed, and Samuel felt a deep connection to her that went beyond their mutual love of the darkness. He knew that he was no longer just a lover of dark humor, but a lover of life itself. But even as Samuel felt himself drifting away from the darkness, he knew that it would always be a part of him. It was a reminder of where he had come from, and the journey that had brought him to this moment. And so, with a newfound sense of joy and lightness, Samuel and his companion continued to explore the world around them, both the light and the dark hand in hand. Chapter 31. As weeks passed, Samuel found himself becoming increasingly restless. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. His companion seemed to sense his unease, but she didn't say anything. One afternoon, they were exploring an abandoned hospital when they heard a strange noise coming from down the hall. Samuel's companion urged him to be cautious, but he was curious. As they turned the corner, they found themselves face to face with a group of hooded figures. Samuel's companion felt for his hand, but it was too late. The figures had already started to advance towards them. Samuel felt a surge of panic rise up within him. He knew he was out of his depth, and he wished he had never started down this dark path. But it was too late now. The hooded figures circled around Samuel and his companion, and they began to chant in a language Samuel didn't understand. Fear pulsed through his veins, and he knew that he was about to meet his end. But suddenly, there was a bright light that filled the room. The hooded figures recoiled, and Samuel and his companion were able to make their escape. They stumbled out into the daylight, gasping for breath. Samuel turned to his companion, a look of confusion on his face. "What just happened?" he asked her. She smiled at him, her eyes filled with a quiet wisdom that he had never noticed before. "You finally found the balance between the light and the darkness. And now you're ready for what comes next." Samuel didn't know what that meant, but he was grateful for his companion's reassurance. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose. As they walked away from the abandoned hospital, Samuel knew that he was ready to face whatever horrors lay ahead. He was a lover of dark humor, but he was also a survivor. Chapter 32. Samuel and his companion walked through the empty hospital, their footsteps echoing throughout the halls. The air was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional creak of old pipes. Samuel's nerves were on edge, he felt like they were being watched. Suddenly, a sound echoed down the hallway. It was the familiar sound of laughter, but it was distorted and twisted, like it was coming from a different world. Samuel's companion tensed up, her dark energy crackling around her. "Be careful," she whispered to Samuel. "Something isn't right." They cautiously made their way through the abandoned hospital, following the laughter. As they turned a corner, they saw a group of figures in hooded robes, their faces obscured by shadows. Samuel's heart pounded with fear. But then, the figures began to move. They started to dance in a circle, their movements jerky and unnatural. Samuel realized with a start that they were performing some sort of ritual. He watched in terror as one of the figures stepped forward and extracted something from a small box. It was a small writhing creature, its limbs bending in unnatural ways. Samuel could feel his stomach churning with disgust and fear. Suddenly, the creature escaped from the figure's grasp and started to dart towards Samuel and his companion. Samuel tried to dodge out of the way, but the creature latched onto his arm. The pain was excruciating. He could feel the creature burrowing into his skin, spreading its dark energy throughout his body. Through the haze of pain, Samuel heard his companion's voice calling out to him. He could feel her dark energy surging through him, fighting back against the creature's influence. Slowly but surely, they were able to push it back and banish it from Samuel's body. As the last of the creature's dark energy dissipated, Samuel slumped to the ground, exhausted and drained. His companion knelt beside him, cradling his head. "You're going to be okay," she said softly. "You're strong enough to fight this darkness." Samuel nodded weakly, the events of the past few months catching up with him. He had come so far in embracing his inner darkness, but he knew now that it was a dangerous path to walk alone. He needed his companion by his side if he was going to make it through the horrors that lay ahead. Together, they stood up and continued down the hallway, ready for whatever came next. Chapter 33. Samuel and his companion continued to explore abandoned places, finding twisted remnants of humanity's past. They traveled from city to city, delving deeper into the darkness, and finding strange, unexplainable things that would have made others shudder in fear. One night, as they explored an old, run-down hotel, they came upon a sealed room with strange symbols scribbled on the door. The air inside the room was thick with the stench of sulfur and the sound of whispers. Samuel and his companion paused, looking at each other in silent confirmation of their next move. Without uttering a word, they slowly pushed open the door. The room was dark, and the walls were covered in shadows. They could hear the whispers more clearly now, and they could sense a malevolent presence just beyond their sight. And then it came, a voice that filled the room and chilled Samuel to his very core. "You shouldn't be here," it hissed, anger in every syllable. Samuel's companion stepped forward, her hand raising as she used her dark energy to push back against the malevolent presence. The room erupted in a bright light, and the voice was silenced. They emerged from the room shaken but unharmed. They both knew they had just encountered something they couldn't explain, something beyond their reckoning. As Samuel and his companion continued on their journey, he felt something stirring inside him, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He felt as though he was on the brink of something deep and dark that would change him forever. But for better or worse, he knew he couldn't turn back now. The darkness was a part of him, and he would continue to explore it, risking everything for a chance to glimpse what lay beyond. Chapter 34. As the days passed, Samuel felt a sense of unease grow within him. His once beloved exploration of the darkness and the unknown felt tainted by the malevolent presence they had encountered in the sealed room. He tried to brush it off, but every time he closed his eyes, he could see the strange symbols etched into the walls, burning into his mind. One night, as he lay awake, his companion sound asleep beside him, he heard a faint whispering. At first he thought it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, but as the whispers grew louder, he knew something was wrong. He looked over at his companion, hoping for some kind of comfort, but her eyes were open and staring off into the distance. A chill ran down Samuel's spine as he realized that she too was hearing the whispers. They sat up in bed, their eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. The whispers grew louder, and the air around them felt thick with an unknown energy. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman, with skin as white as snow and hair as black as night. Her eyes were red, like the glowing eyes Samuel had seen in the abandoned institution. Samuel and his companion tried to run, but the woman's grip was too strong. They were trapped, at her mercy. The woman spoke in a language Samuel didn't understand, her voice like 1,000 screams echoing through his mind. He felt his sanity slipping away, his grip on reality becoming more tenuous by the second. Just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, a bright light filled the room. The woman let out a blood-curdling scream and vanished, leaving Samuel and his companion gasping for air. They knew they couldn't stay there any longer. They needed to find out what was happening and put an end to it before it was too late. Samuel and his companion packed their bags and set out into the night, determined to face whatever was causing the whispers and the strange woman. Despite their fear, they knew they were better off together than alone. Chapter 35. As Samuel and the werewolf made their way out of the abandoned hospital, they stumbled upon a young woman huddled in the corner of a dimly lit hallway. She was shivering and looked terrified. Samuel approached her cautiously, trying not to startle her. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. The woman looked up at him with tear-filled eyes. "They took my friends," she whispered. Samuel's heart sank. He knew what it was like to feel helpless and alone in a dangerous situation. He glanced at the werewolf, nodding silently before turning back to the woman. "We'll help you find them," he said, offering his hand to help her up. As they made their way through the hospital, the woman told them about a group of friends who had gone exploring and hadn't returned. Samuel and the werewolf searched room by room, their hearts pounding with every creaking floorboard and rustling sound. Finally, they found a door that was slightly ajar. Inside, they could hear muffled voices and the sound of chains rattling. Samuel pushed the door open slowly, and they crept inside. In the center of the room, they saw a group of hooded figures, surrounding a group of people who were chained to the wall. As they stepped closer, one of the figures turned towards them, revealing glowing red eyes. Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. This was what they had been searching for. "You shouldn't have come here," the hooded figure snarled. But Samuel was done being afraid. With the woman at his side and the werewolf by his side, he knew they could face whatever was waiting for them. And he was ready. Chapter 36. Samuel and the werewolf carefully approached the hooded figures, trying to remain unnoticed. They observed the victims, who were all in a state of catatonia, and could not be roused from their trance-like state. One of the hooded figures stepped forward, revealing a face that appeared to be made entirely out of shadows. It spoke in a hissing, cold voice. "You are not welcome here. Leave now or face the consequences." Samuel stood his ground, feeling a surge of courage. "Who are you? What have you done to these people?" The shadow-faced figure sneered. "We are the keepers of the dark, and these people are sacrifices that will help us bring about a new age of darkness. You cannot stop us." Samuel felt a cold sweat break out over his body as he realized the gravity of the situation. He and the werewolf were vastly outnumbered and outmatched. But he refused to give up. Suddenly, a bright light filled the room, causing the hooded figures to shriek in pain and confusion. Samuel shielded his eyes, but could feel the warmth and power emanating from the light. When the light faded, he saw that the hooded figures had vanished, leaving the victims chained to the wall. Samuel and the werewolf hurried to free them, and were relieved to see that they were all unharmed. The terrified woman they had met earlier clung to Samuel's arm, grateful for their rescue. Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Samuel looked around the room, feeling a sense of unease. He knew that this was not the end of the keepers of the dark, and that they would continue to do their evil work. He knew that he and the werewolf would have to continue their journey and confront the darkness head-on. Chapter 37. As they left the abandoned hospital behind, Samuel and his companion knew that their work was far from over. The keepers of the dark may have been defeated, but the darkness they worshipped remained, lingering in the shadows and waiting to strike again. In the days that followed, Samuel and the werewolf scoured the city for any signs of the keepers' influence. They snuck into abandoned buildings and explored hidden tunnels, always on the lookout for any hint of the glowing red eyes that haunted their nightmares. But despite their best efforts, they found nothing. The city remained quiet, and the darkness seemed to have retreated back into the shadows where it belonged. It wasn't until weeks later that Samuel heard the whispers again. They were faint at first, barely audible above the sound of the wind, but they grew stronger with each passing night. And then one night he saw the glowing red eyes once more. He was walking home from work when he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He turned around, just in time to see a hooded figure with glowing red eyes disappear around the corner. Samuel's heart raced as he ran after the figure, not knowing what he would find when he caught up. But when he turned the corner, he found only an empty alleyway, the darkness closing in around him like a suffocating blanket. He turned to go back the way he came, when he heard a soft growl beside him. The werewolf had followed him, its eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of danger. Together, they made their way back home, a sense of dread settling over them like a heavy fog. They both knew that the keepers of the dark were still out there, waiting to strike again. And this time, they might not be so lucky. Chapter 38. Samuel tried to shake off the feeling of being watched as he walked down the empty streets of the city. He had become hyper-aware of his surroundings since his last encounter with the keepers of the dark. Every shadow felt like it could be hiding one of their hooded figures. As he passed an alleyway, he heard the sound of whispers coming from within. His heart rate increased as he cautiously stepped closer to investigate. The whispers grew louder and he could make out the words, "He's coming. He's coming." Suddenly, a pair of glowing red eyes appeared from the darkness, followed by another and another. The hooded figures emerged, surrounding Samuel. "You thought you could defeat us," a voice boomed from within one of the hoods. "But we are eternal. We are the keepers of the darkness, and we will never be stopped." Samuel reached for his pocket, feeling for the small flashlight he always carried with him. His hand closed around it, and he flipped it on, pointing it at the hooded figures. The brightness of the flashlight seemed to repel the hooded figures, and they hissed and recoiled from the light. Samuel took advantage of their momentary weakness and bolted, sprinting down the street as fast as he could. He didn't stop until he was back at his apartment, panting and gasping for air. He knew that he needed to come up with a way to stop the keepers of the dark, once and for all. He couldn't keep running forever. But for now, all he could do was wait and prepare for the next attack. He sat in the darkness of his apartment, waiting for the inevitable return of the hooded figures. And he knew that when they came, he would be ready. Chapter 39. Samuel sat on his couch, his heart hammering in his chest. He had managed to fight off the keepers of the dark, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they came back. He heard a knock at the door and jumped, his hand instinctively reaching for the baseball bat he kept beside the couch. He hesitated for a moment before cautiously approaching the door and peering through the peephole. Standing outside was a woman, her face obscured by a hooded jacket. Samuel hesitated before slowly opening the door, the bat still held tightly in his hand. "Can I help you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The woman stepped forward, pulling back her hood to reveal a face that Samuel recognized from his past, Emily, his ex-girlfriend. "What are you doing here?" Samuel asked, his grip on the bat tightening. "I need your help," Emily said, her eyes pleading. "I know we didn't end things well, but I don't know who else to turn to." Samuel hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door and allowing Emily to step inside. As she explained her situation, Samuel couldn't help but feel that this was all part of the keeper's plan. But as Emily's words sunk in, he realized that he couldn't turn her away, even if it put him in danger. Together, they would face off against the keepers of the dark once again, hoping that this time they could put an end to their twisted plans for good. Chapter 40. Samuel and Emily stepped into the keeper's headquarters, a dimly lit basement filled with cages and torture devices. The air was thick with the stench of blood and fear. The hooded figures stood before them, their glowing red eyes fixed on the couple. "We have been waiting for you," one of them spoke in a low, sinister voice. Samuel's heart raced as he pulled out his flashlight, ready to defend himself and Emily. But he knew that they were outnumbered, and the keepers had powers beyond comprehension. "You cannot stop us," another keeper said, a hand raised towards Emily. She flinched, but Samuel stepped forward, shielding her from harm. "You leave her out of this." The keepers chuckled, their eyes flashing brighter. "You underestimate our abilities, Samuel. We can do whatever we want." Suddenly, the keepers froze, their eyes staring blankly ahead. Samuel looked around, confused, until he saw a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was the same werewolf he had encountered before, his eyes now a bright white that radiated a fierce power. The werewolf spoke in a booming voice, "You have meddled with powers beyond your comprehension. You will leave this place now or face the consequences." The keepers hesitated for a moment, but then quickly retreated, disappearing into the shadows. Samuel and Emily were left alone with the werewolf, who turned to them, his eyes now a warm brown. "You have done well to stand against the keepers," he said. "But beware, they will not give up so easily. You must be careful." Samuel nodded, feeling a sense of relief but also dread. The keepers were still out there, and he knew they would come back for revenge. He looked at Emily, who had an expression of fear mixed with admiration. "We have to keep fighting," he told her. "No matter what." She nodded, and they left the basement, unsure of what the future would hold. The darkness had only just begun. Chapter 41. Samuel and Emily ran out of the keeper's headquarters, their hearts pounding with fear. They knew that they had just narrowly escaped death. "What do we do now?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Samuel took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "We need to find out more about these keepers," he said. "We need to know what they want, and why they're after us." "But how do we do that?" Emily asked. Samuel thought for a moment. "We need to find someone who knows about the keepers," he said. "Someone who has dealt with them before." "Who could that be?" Emily asked. Samuel's mind raced. He knew of no one who had dealt with the keepers before. But then he thought of someone who might have some information. "There's a man I know," he said slowly. He's kind of a strange guy. But he might know something about the keepers." "Who is he?" Emily asked. "His name is Isaac," Samuel said. "He lives in a cabin out in the woods. I've talked to him a few times before, and he's interesting to say the least." Emily looked skeptical. "Do you really think he can help us?" she asked. "I don't know," Samuel said. "But it's worth a shot. We have to try something." Emily nodded. "Okay," she said. "Let's go see this Isaac." The two of them got into Samuel's car and drove out of the city, into the deep woods. After an hour of driving, they finally arrived at a small cabin in a clearing. "This is it," Samuel said, getting out of the car. "Isaac's place." The door of the cabin opened, and a tall, thin man with wild gray hair and a scruffy beard stepped out. "Samuel," he exclaimed. "What brings you out here, my friend?" "I need your help, Isaac," Samuel said. "We're being hunted by some dangerous people. We need to know everything you can tell us about the keepers of the dark." Isaac's eyes widened. "The keepers," he said. "You've tangled with them, have you?" "We have," Emily said. "And we need to know how to stop them." Isaac's face grew serious. "Come inside," he said. "I'll tell you what I know." Samuel and Emily followed him into the cabin. As they sat down at a wooden table, Isaac began to speak. "The Keepers of the Dark," he said, his voice low. "They're an ancient organization, Samuel. They've been around for centuries, maybe even longer. Nobody knows for sure where they came from, but they're powerful and they're dangerous." "What do they want?" Emily asked. Isaac shook his head. "Nobody knows that either," he said. "Some say they worship some kind of dark god, others say they're just power-hungry. But whatever their motives, they'll stop at nothing to achieve their goals." "What can we do?" Samuel asks. How can we stop them? Isaac leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. There's only one way to stop them, Samuel, he said. You have to destroy their source of power. What source of power? Emily asks. Isaac hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to reveal something. Finally he spoke. The keepers of the dark draw their power from a portal, he said. A doorway between our world and something else. If you can find that portal, Samuel, and close it, that might be the only way to stop them. Samuel and Emily exchanged a glance. Closing a portal to another world. It sounded impossible. But they knew that they had to try. How do we find this portal, Isaac? Samuel asks. Isaac smiled grimly. I have an idea, he said. But it's not going to be easy. And with that he leaned forward and began to speak. The night outside grew even darker, as Samuel and Emily listened to the strange man in the cabin. They both knew that they were getting closer to the truth about the keepers of the dark, but they also knew that the danger ahead of them was greater than they had ever imagined. Chapter 42. Samuel, Emily, and Isaac set out to find the portal that holds the keepers of the dark's power. They walked for hours until they came across an old abandoned church. Isaac led them inside and showed them a hidden cellar door. He informed them that the portal was located in the underground chamber, but warned them of the danger that awaited them. As they descended into the darkness, dread filled Samuel's heart. He felt like they were walking into a trap. The only sound was their footsteps on the old creaky stairs. Once they reached the bottom, they were met with a putrid smell that made Samuel's stomach churn. The room was filled with dark energy, and the portal stood like a black hole in the center of the room. It was so immense that Samuel felt like he was being pulled towards it. They knew they had to act fast. Samuel, Emily, and Isaac spread out and searched for a way to close the portal. Samuel noticed a strange inscription on one of the walls. As he approached it, he felt a cold breeze brush past him. He read the inscription out loud, and suddenly, the vines on the wall began to writhe and twist. The wall began to crumble, revealing an old stone box. Samuel hesitated before he opened the box, but Emily urged him on. Inside the box was a vial of glowing red liquid. Isaac explained that it was a potion that could weaken the keepers of the dark. Samuel felt a sense of relief that they had finally found a weapon against their enemy. As they made their way back to the surface, they heard a bone-chilling growl coming from the darkness. Samuel shuddered at the thought of facing the keepers again. They were so close to closing the portal and ending the keepers' reign of terror once and for all, but they knew that the battle was far from over. Samuel, Emily, and Isaac emerged from the cellar, ready to fight for their lives. They had no idea what horrors awaited them, but they knew that they had to face them together. They stood there, gazing out into the darkness, ready to face their enemy head-on. Chapter 43. Samuel, Emily, and Isaac stood back to back, ready to face the keepers of the dark. They could see glowing red eyes closing in on them from every direction. Samuel took out the potion and tossed it in the direction of one of the keepers. The hooded figure let out a blood-curdling scream as it began to disintegrate. The others hesitated for a moment, but then charged at the group of keepers with renewed courage. They threw punches and kicks, dodging the sharp claws of their enemies. Emily landed a solid hit on one of the keepers, sending it flying backwards. Isaac used his knowledge of the occult to chant a spell that weakened the keepers further. The hooded figures began to fade into nothingness, their eyes losing their sinister glow. With a final burst of energy, Samuel and his group took down the last of the keepers. They breathed a sigh of relief and fell to their knees, exhausted but triumphant. As they caught their breath, Emily turned to Samuel. "We did it, Samuel," she said, grinning. "We defeated them." Samuel felt a sense of accomplishment wash over him. He had never been one to back down from a challenge, but this was different. This was a victory over evil. And he had done it with the help of his friends. But as the adrenaline began to fade, Samuel realized that this was not the end. The keepers may be gone, but there would always be more like them. He knew that he and his group would have to be ready to face whatever darkness may come their way. And as they made their way back to the surface, Samuel couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement at the thought of what new horrors they might face in the future. Chapter 44. Samuel couldn't believe they had actually defeated the Keepers of the Dark. His heart raced with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. Emily and Isaac were both panting heavily, but they all knew that they had to keep moving. They climbed up the stairs from the underground chamber, and saw the sky get lighter with every step. As they emerged into the dawn light, they were relieved to see that the forest around them was peaceful. Birds chirped and squirrels scurried up trees. It was like nothing had happened. Samuel breathed in the fresh air, and turned to Emily and Isaac. "Thank you both. I couldn't have done it without you." Emily smiled at him warmly. "We're in this together, remember?" Isaac added, "We need to get as far away from here as possible. The keepers won't be happy about what we did." Samuel nodded in agreement. "Let's go. We'll figure out what to do next." As they walked further down the path, Isaac suddenly stopped. "Wait. Do you hear that?" They all went silent and listened. In the distance, they could hear a low growl. Samuel's heart sank. "It's not over yet, is it?" Emily and Isaac both shook their heads. "No, it's not. But we'll face it together." Chapter 45. Samuel, Emily, and Isaac cautiously followed the growling sound until they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a man, tall and muscular, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to glow in the moonlight. The man introduced himself as Hunter, a renowned monster hunter who had been tracking the Keepers of the Dark for months. He had heard the commotion from the underground chamber and had followed the group to the clearing. Hunter explained that the Keepers were just the tip of the iceberg. There were more creatures lurking in the darkness, waiting for their moment to strike. He showed them his arsenal of weapons, each designed to take down a specific type of monster. Despite his gruff exterior, Samuel couldn't help but be drawn to Hunter's confidence and bravery. He had never met anyone like him before. As they talked, Hunter suddenly stiffened and reached for his crossbow. A low growl echoed through the clearing, and a pack of werewolves emerged from the shadows. Samuel, Emily, and Isaac were frozen in terror, but Hunter stood his ground. He fired a bolt that hit one of the werewolves square in the chest, causing it to howl in pain and retreat. The other werewolves hesitated, unsure of whether to continue their attack. Hunter bared his teeth in a fierce growl, his eyes flashing with determination. With a snarl, the werewolves turned and ran back into the darkness. "Come on," Hunter said, sheathing his crossbow. "We've got work to do." And with that, Samuel, Emily, Isaac, and Hunter set off into the night, ready to face whatever darkness lay ahead. Chapter 46. As they trekked through the dense forest, Samuel stumbled on a hidden root and fell face first onto the ground. Emily and Isaac rushed to his aid, but their concern turned into fits of laughter as they saw his embarrassed expression. "Smooth move, Casanova," Isaac teased, still snickering. "I always knew you would fall for us one day," Emily added, unable to contain her giggles. Samuel, red-faced, couldn't help but chuckle at their jokes. Maybe they had been through a lot of dark and scary situations, but they were still just a bunch of friends who enjoyed each other's company, even in the weirdest of circumstances. They continued walking, Hunter leading the way and the three friends trailing behind him, still giggling at Samuel's mishap. As they walked, Emily spotted a bush loaded with ripe berries, and her eyes sparkled mischievously. "Watch this," she whispered to her friends, plucking a berry and carefully aiming it at Hunter's head. The berry hit its target with a satisfying squish, and Hunter spun around, hand instinctively flying to his weapon. However, as he saw the three friends trying and failing to hide their snickers, he couldn't help but let out a small chuckle himself. "You guys are something else," he said, shaking his head amusedly. The four of them continued their journey, feeling a little lighter and happier than before. Who knew that even in the midst of all the darkness and danger, a simple berry could bring some much-needed laughter? Chapter 47. Despite their laughter, the group remained wary of what lurked in the darkness. Hunter led them through winding paths in the forest, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. Samuel's heart raced as he felt something brush against his leg. He looked down to see a snake slithering away from him. "Be careful. There are more dangerous creatures than this," Hunter warned them. As they continued, they heard a sound that made Emily freeze in fear, the sound of water dripping. They had heard that sound before, in the abandoned mental institution. The group looked around, trying to locate the source of the sound. Then they saw it, a small opening in the ground with water seeping out. "Let's investigate," Hunter said, lifting the lid of the opening. The group peered into the darkness. It was a narrow tunnel, leading underground. Hunter was the first to step down, his flashlight illuminating the walls. The others followed slowly, their hearts pounding with every step. As they descended, they heard whispers echoing through the tunnel. They couldn't make out what was being said, but the voices were unmistakably human. Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of place was this? Finally, they reached the bottom of the tunnel and emerged into a large room carved out of the earth. The walls were covered in crude drawings of monsters and demons, and the air was thick with the stench of rotting flesh. "What is this place?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Hunter looked around with a sense of familiarity. "This is the lair of the Cult of the Dark. They're a group of people who worship the creatures that roam the night." "Are they dangerous?" Isaac asked. Hunter nodded. "Very. We need to leave now." But it was already too late. The sound of chanting filled the air, and the group turned to see a group of people dressed in black robes holding candles. They had been surrounded. Samuel felt a sense of dread wash over him. They were trapped. Chapter 48. As the chanting grew louder, Samuel and his friends looked around the room in fear. The Cult of the Dark had surrounded them on all sides, their faces hidden in the shadows. The flickering candles cast eerie shadows on the walls. Samuel's heart raced as he tried to come up with a way out. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was a tall man with long black hair and a leather jacket. He had a sharp, angular face and piercing blue eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. The man raised a hand and the chanting stopped. "Welcome, my friends," he said in a smooth, deep voice. "I am Vlad, and I have been watching you. I see you have proven yourselves to be worthy of joining our ranks." Samuel and his friends exchanged uneasy looks. They had no interest in joining a cult. "We're not interested," Samuel said firmly. Vlad's expression chilled. "Oh, I think you will be," he said, his voice taking on a menacing edge. "You see, I have something you want. Something you need." He held up a small, glowing crystal. It pulsed with an otherworldly light that seemed to draw Samuel in. He felt a strange energy coursing through his veins, and he knew without a doubt that he wanted that crystal. "What is it?" he asked, unable to tear his gaze away from the glowing gem. "It is the key to ultimate power," Vlad said. "The power to control the darkness itself. With this crystal, you could rule the world." Samuel felt his mouth water. He wanted that power more than anything. But he knew better than to trust Vlad. He could sense the danger in the man's eyes. "I don't believe you," Samuel said, taking a step back. Vlad smiled coldly. "You will," he said, and with a wave of his hand the doors to the room slammed shut, trapping Samuel and his friends inside. Chapter 49. Samuel and his friends stared at Vlad, unsure of his true intentions. The room was filled with a tense silence before Vlad broke into laughter. "You should have seen the looks on your faces," he exclaimed between chuckles. "I'm just messing with you. I'm not actually a member of the Cult of the Dark. I just like to mess with people who stumble upon their little meetings." A wave of relief washed over Samuel and his friends as they joined in on the laughter. It felt good to finally let go of their fear and enjoy a moment of levity. Vlad offered to show them a way out of the room, and led them through a secret passageway that he had discovered during one of his previous pranks. As they walked through the passage, Vlad regaled them with stories of his previous pranks and misadventures. The tension that had been building within the group dissipated as they laughed and joked with Vlad. They emerged from the passage into a beautiful garden, illuminated by the moonlight. The night air was cool and fresh, and the sound of leaves rustling in the wind was soothing. As they walked through the garden, Samuel reflected on their journey. It had been filled with dark twists and turns, but they had emerged stronger, more resilient, and with a new appreciation for the value of humor in the face of danger. They had been through hell, but they had come out the other side with a newfound sense of joy and camaraderie. They settled down in a clearing in the garden, swapping stories and jokes and drinking beer that Vlad had smuggled in from his backpack. They laughed freely, enjoying the simple pleasures that they had learned to appreciate so much more after their harrowing experiences. As the night wore on, the group grew tired and decided to turn in for the night. They said their goodbyes to Vlad and set up camp in a nearby clearing. As they drifted off to sleep, Samuel felt a sense of contentment. Despite the horrors they had faced, he realized that he had found true friends in the most unlikely of places. Chapter 50. As they woke up to the sound of birds chirping, Samuel and his friends realized they had slept in the garden longer than they intended. They quickly packed up their things and started walking towards their next destination, a haunted mansion rumored to be the site of several unsolved murders. The group joked and laughed as they walked, but Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As they approached the mansion, they noticed that the windows were boarded up and the doors were chained shut. Emily suggested they find a way in through the attic, so they started searching for a ladder. Hunter found one leaning against a nearby tree, and they propped it up against the side of the mansion. As they climbed up to the attic, they heard strange noises coming from the lower floors. Samuel suggested that they stick together, but his friends laughed it off as they entered the eerie room. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, and the room was plunged into darkness. Samuel heard footsteps approaching, but when he turned on his flashlight, there was no one there. The group started to panic as they realized they were being hunted. They searched for a way out, but the windows were too high and the door was blocked. Suddenly, the room was illuminated by a bright light, and they saw the ghostly figure of a woman standing in front of them. Samuel tried to run, but the woman floated towards him and touched his face with her icy hand. He felt a chill run down his spine as he saw the scars on her neck, realizing too late that they had stumbled upon the site of her murder. The group screamed as they were enveloped by the darkness once more. As they huddled together, Samuel's friends admitted that their love for dark humor had gone too far. They promised to never make light of real tragedy again, and begged for forgiveness from the spirits that haunted the mansion. Suddenly, the door creaked open and the group stumbled out into the light of day, shaken but alive. As they walked away from the mansion, Samuel couldn't help but feel grateful for his friends' newfound understanding of the consequences of their actions. But he also couldn't shake the feeling that they had narrowly escaped something much darker than they could have ever imagined. Chapter 51. As they fled the haunted mansion, Samuel and his friends breathed a sigh of relief. But their reprieve was short-lived as they found themselves in a desolate wasteland. The garden they had just left had disappeared, replaced by a barren landscape. Panic set in as they realized they were lost, and Samuel's fear began to gnaw at him like a rat. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His companions, meanwhile, began to bicker amongst themselves. Tensions rose, and it wasn't long before fingers were pointed and blame was assigned. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shook violently, knocking them to the ground. A massive creature had appeared before them, and it was unlike anything they had ever seen. It was covered in fur, had razor-sharp teeth, and its glowing eyes bore into their souls. The creature let out a deafening roar and charged straight at them. Samuel and his friends scattered like leaves in the wind, each one running in a different direction. Samuel found himself alone, cowering behind a rock as the creature closed in on him. Just as Samuel was about to give up hope, the creature stopped in its tracks and began to transform. Its fur receded, its teeth shrank, and its eyes lost their fiery glow. In its place stood a man, and Samuel recognized him immediately as the werewolf from the abandoned mental institution. The werewolf chuckled and extended a hand to Samuel. "Come on, buddy, we've got to keep moving if we're going to survive in this place." Samuel took the werewolf's hand, grateful for the company and guidance. They set off together, unsure of what horrors awaited them around every corner. Chapter 52. Samuel and his friends were grateful for the werewolf's help in navigating the treacherous wasteland. They had been wandering for what felt like days, running low on food and water, and encountering all kinds of terrifying creatures. The werewolf, whose name was Max, had proven to be a valuable ally. He showed them how to find water in the barren landscape, and hunted for them to ensure they had enough to eat. As they walked, Max told them stories of his past, how he had become cursed with his werewolf form and had been wandering the wasteland ever since. Despite his fearsome appearance, Max was intelligent and kind. Samuel found himself drawn to the werewolf, admiring his resilience in the face of such adversity. But as they walked, Samuel noticed a subtle change in Max's demeanor. Occasionally, the werewolf's eyes would flicker from their usual brown to a deep glowing red. Samuel brushed it off at first, thinking it was just a trick of the light. But the more time they spent with Max, the more often his eyes would change. Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that they were walking into a trap. One night as they settled down to rest, Samuel voiced his concerns to his friends. They had all noticed the strange behavior, but were unsure what to do about it. As they sat in silence, Max suddenly sprang to his feet, his eyes blazing red. "You shouldn't have come here," he growled, his voice deep and guttural. "My pack will tear you apart." Samuel and his friends scrambled to their feet, their hearts pounding with fear. They had trusted Max, had relied on him to guide them through the wasteland. Now it seemed that they had been playing right into his claws. They ran, heart-pounding, as Max transformed into a massive snarling beast behind them. His pack howled in the distance, closing in. Samuel and his friends knew they were no match for the werewolves, but they refused to go down without a fight. As they ran, Samuel's mind raced. How could they have been so foolish, to trust a creature that could turn on them at any moment? How could they have been so blinded by their desire for survival? If they managed to make it out alive, Samuel knew that things would never be the same. The darkness had taken hold of him, and he wasn't sure if he could ever return to his old life. But now all he could focus on was running from the creature he had once called a friend. Chapter 53. Samuel and his friends ran as fast as they could, their hearts pounding in their chests. They could hear the howls of the werewolf pack behind them, getting closer and closer. They had been foolish to trust the werewolf, and now they were paying for it. As they ran, Samuel saw something in the distance. It was a small cabin with smoke rising from its chimney. He signaled to his friends, and they veered off course to head towards it. They burst through the door, panting heavily, and found themselves in a dimly lit room. There was an old woman sitting by the fireplace, stirring a pot. "Please," Samuel gasped, "we need your help. We're being chased by werewolves." The old woman didn't look up from her pot. "I know. I've been expecting you," she said in a raspy voice. Samuel and his friends exchanged wary glances. "What do you mean?" he asked. The old woman finally looked up, revealing a face that was wrinkled and weathered. "I knew you would come. You see, I have a proposition for you." Samuel leaned in, intrigued despite his fear. "What kind of proposition?" "I can give you all the power you desire," the old woman said. "But you must give me something in return." Samuel could feel the darkness creeping in again, and he knew his friends felt it too. But he couldn't ignore the feeling of being in control, of having that power. "What do you want?" he asked. The old woman smiled sinisterly. "Your souls." Samuel and his friends looked at each other, unsure of what to do. But the howls of the werewolves outside brought them back to reality. "We'll do it," Samuel said decisively. "We'll give you our souls." The old woman cackled, and Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. But he also felt something else, something powerful. He knew that he and his friends were about to embark on a journey that they would never forget. Chapter 54. Samuel's mind was consumed with thoughts of the power he had gained from the old woman. He couldn't shake the feeling of recklessness and excitement that surged through him every time he thought about it. His friends seemed to feel the same way. They walked through the wasteland like hunters, relishing the darkness that surrounded them. But suddenly, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The trees around them shook as if a great gust of wind had blown through. Only it wasn't wind that caused the quaking. It was a low growling, a guttural roar that grew louder and louder until it seemed to surround them. The pack of werewolves had caught up with them. Samuel and his friends took up defensive positions, bracing themselves for the attack. They had made a grave mistake by trusting the old woman and making a deal with her. They had sold their souls for power, and now they were about to pay the price. The werewolves charged them, snarling and snapping their jaws. Samuel and his friends fought back with all the dark power they had gained, hurling energy blasts and unleashing torrents of dark magic. The battle raged on for what felt like hours, but eventually they managed to drive the werewolves back. Samuel and his friends were battered and bloodied, but they had won. As they caught their breath, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The darkness that had taken hold of them was insatiable, and they had no idea where it would lead them. But one thing was for certain, they were in for a terrifying ride. Chapter 55. Samuel and his friends stood in the midst of the gruesome aftermath of the battle. The once beautiful cabin was now in shambles, its walls stained with blood and the remains of their enemies. Samuel felt a sense of power coursing through his veins, but the feeling was quickly replaced with dread as he realized the consequences of their actions. His friends seemed to be reveling in their newfound darkness, but Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed a line into a world of horror. As they stepped out of the cabin, they were greeted by the sight of a full moon in the sky. It was then that Samuel noticed the change in his friends. Their eyes glowed with a fierce intensity, and their teeth sharpened into fangs. Samuel realized with horror that the old woman had cursed them with lycanthropy. They were now werewolves, and as the moon rose higher, Samuel felt the beast within him stir. The group shifted into their wolf forms, their fur bristling with power as they howled at the moon. As they ran through the woods, Samuel couldn't help but feel a sense of fear and exhilaration. Their newfound abilities were exhilarating, but the knowledge that they were now monsters was a weight that he couldn't shake. The line between reality and nightmare was growing thinner with every passing moment. As the night wore on, the group came across a small town. The lights were still on in some of the houses, and Samuel felt an inexplicable urge to hunt. They crept through the streets, their senses heightened by their lycanthropy, until they came across a young couple walking through the park. Samuel and his friends pounced, their jaws clamping down on flesh as the couple screamed in terror. The taste of blood was exhilarating, and Samuel could feel the darkness within him growing stronger. But as the night wore on and the sun began to rise, Samuel was filled with a sense of dread. They had become everything they had joked about, and the world was no longer a safe place for them. As they retreated into the woods, Samuel knew that they were forever changed, and he couldn't help but wonder what other horrors awaited them in their new life as lovers of dark humor. Chapter 56. Days passed since Samuel and his friends killed the young couple, and the guilt began to eat away at them. They couldn't believe what they had become, and they struggled to control their newly acquired instincts. One day, as they were wandering through the woods, they stumbled upon a group of campers. The group was made up of families with young children, and Samuel's friends immediately turned to hunt them down. Samuel knew he had to put an end to this madness. He tried to reason with his friends, but they were too far gone. With tears in his eyes, Samuel took on his friends in a fierce battle. It was a fight for survival, and no one was backing down. At first, Samuel's friends had the upper hand, but soon enough Samuel's superior strength and wit turned the tide. One by one they fell to the ground, defeated. As the fight came to an end, Samuel realized that he had one last task to complete. He had to put an end to his own life, for he knew that he could never return to his old self. With a heavy heart, Samuel took his own life, hoping that his friends' souls could find peace without him. The woods were silent, the only sound was that of the leaves rustling in the wind. The campers were long gone, and no one ever knew what had happened in the woods that day. But for Samuel's friends, the guilt and pain never left them. They continued to roam the woods, searching for a way to rid themselves of the curse. As for Samuel, he was forever remembered as a tragic figure, a victim of his own love for dark humor. His death was a reminder that sometimes, the things we love the most can also be the most dangerous. Chapter 57. Samuel's body had barely grown cold when his friends began to feel the weight of his absence. They mourned him in their own twisted way, telling dark jokes and reminiscing about the thrill of their hunts. But something was different now, something had changed. Without Samuel to guide them, their hunts had grown reckless and their kills more brutal. As they wandered through the woods searching for their next victim, they began to hear whispers on the wind. Strange voices that seemed to call out to them, promising power and darkness beyond their wildest dreams. And so they followed the whispers, deeper and deeper into the woods, until they came upon a clearing unlike any they had seen before. In the center of the clearing stood a tall, twisted tree, its bark black as night. And hanging from its branches were strange, glowing fruits, pulsing with a dark energy that seemed to draw the werewolves closer. Without hesitation, they sank their teeth into the fruits, feeling the power coursing through their veins once more. But as the darkness took hold, they realized too late that they had been lured into a trap. The ground rumbled beneath them, and from the earth emerged a horde of twisted, corrupted creatures, their eyes glowing with a sickly green light. The werewolves tried to fight back, but they were outnumbered and outmatched by the creatures that poured forth from the earth. With no other options left, they fled, abandoning the cursed clearing and their newfound power. But they knew that they could never outrun the darkness they had embraced, and that the creatures that lurked in the earth would forever be on their trail. As they fled, they heard the whispers once more, promising power and darkness beyond imagining. And they knew that they would be forever cursed, trapped in a cycle of blood and horror until the end of their days. Chapter 58. Despite their curse, Samuel's former friends continued to hunt, desperate to quell their hunger and thirst for blood. They roamed through the woods searching for their next prey, and it wasn't long before they came across a small town. With hungry eyes, they watched the people going about their daily business, searching for someone to satisfy their craving. It was then that they saw her, a young, beautiful woman walking alone down the street. One of Samuel's friends, a werewolf with long, sharp claws, lunged at her, but before he could sink his teeth into her flesh, a man appeared out of nowhere and tackled him to the ground. The man was a hunter, and he had been tracking the werewolves for months. He had followed their trail of death and destruction, and now he had them cornered. The hunter had every intention of ending their reign of terror once and for all. The werewolves snarled and growled, circling around the hunter. He remained calm and focused, his eyes darting from one werewolf to the next. Suddenly, a deafening howl echoed through the streets, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Out of the shadows emerged a massive, black werewolf. Its eyes glowed red with a fierce intelligence, and its fur was sleek and shiny. It was the alpha of the pack, and it had come to protect its kin. The hunter pulled out his silver bullets, ready to take down the monsters before him. But before he could shoot, the alpha lunged at him, sinking its teeth into his neck. The hunter screamed in agony, writhing on the ground as the alpha devoured him. The other werewolves watched in horror as their alpha consumed the hunter. They knew that their days were numbered, that they were no match for the powerful creature before them. With a mournful howl, they fled into the night, knowing that they would never be able to outrun their curse. Samuel's former friends ran through the woods, their hearts racing as they tried to escape the wrath of the alpha. Their legs ached and their lungs burned as they pushed themselves to keep going. But no matter how hard they ran, they could hear the alpha's howls echoing through the trees, drawing closer and closer. As dawn broke over the horizon, the werewolves stumbled upon a small cabin in the woods. They collapsed on the ground. Exhausted and defeated, knowing that they had finally met their match. They huddled together, waiting for the inevitable end. But as the sun began to rise, something strange happened. The werewolves began to shift and change, their fur receding and their claws retracting. When the transformation was complete, they found that they were no longer werewolves, but regular humans once again. As they stood up, still shaking from their ordeal, they realized that they had been released from their curse. They were no longer monsters, no longer slaves to their dark humor and thirst for blood. But the memories of their past deeds lingered, haunting them as they made their way back to civilization. They had experienced a darkness that few could ever imagine, a darkness that threatened to consume them entirely. And as they looked back on their journey, they knew that they would never be the same again. For better or for worse, they had tasted the forbidden fruit of darkness, and it had changed them forever. Chapter 59. Samuel's former friends struggled to adjust to their newfound humanity. They had been monsters for so long that their human emotions felt foreign and unfamiliar. They wandered aimlessly through the countryside, searching for something that would ease their guilt and pain. One day, they stumbled upon an old cabin in the woods. It was run down and abandoned, but something drew them inside. As they explored the dark corners of the cabin, they found an old diary. The diary belonged to a woman who had lived in the cabin years ago. She had been a recluse, shunned by society and forced to live in isolation. In her diary, she wrote about the power of darkness and the allure of the unknown. She had experimented with magic and the occult, hoping to find a way to transcend her human limitations. As Samuel's former friends read the diary, they felt a strange pull towards the darkness. They began to experiment with magic and incantations, hoping to unleash their inner demons once more. But the more they dabbled in the dark arts, the more they realized the futility of their actions. They had been cursed once before, and they didn't want to be cursed again. They had caused so much pain and suffering in the past, and they didn't want to go back to that life. In the end, they burned the diary and left the cabin, determined to start anew. They had been given a second chance at life, and they didn't want to waste it. They knew that the memories of their past would haunt them forever, but they wanted to move forward with hope and optimism. As they walked away from the cabin, they felt a new sense of freedom. They had been shackled by their past for so long, but now they could finally break free. They didn't know what the future would hold, but they were excited to find out. For the first time in a long time, they felt truly alive. Chapter 60. As Samuel's former friends ventured deeper into the woods, they found themselves lost in a dense thicket, the trees stretching up towards the sky, looming over them with crooked branches. The air was stagnant and heavy with the stench of decay, and the ground was damp and slippery beneath their feet. With each passing moment, the darkness around them seemed to grow thicker, as if it was alive and breathing down their necks. Shadows danced in the corners of their vision, and strange noises echoed from the depths of the woods. Suddenly, a piercing howl shattered the silence, sending shivers down their spines. They looked around frantically, trying to locate the source of the sound, but they could see nothing but the impenetrable blackness of the forest. As they pressed on, the trees began to thin, revealing a small clearing. In the center of the space stood a gnarled old tree, blackened and twisted like something out of a nightmare. The ground around it was littered with bones and other half-eaten remains. Suddenly, they heard a rustling in the branches above, and a swarm of black, twisted creatures descended upon them. Claws bared and teeth gnashing, they launched themselves at Samuel's former friends, who barely managed to fend them off. Panting and exhausted, they stumbled back towards the edge of the clearing, only to find that the path behind them had vanished. They were trapped, surrounded by darkness and death. As they huddled together, a voice whispered in their ears, tempting them with promises of power and immortality. And for just a moment, they were tempted. But then they heard another sound, faint but unmistakable, the sound of a child crying. With a shared sense of determination, they rallied themselves and set off towards the sound, determined to find the source of the cry and put an end to whatever horror was lurking in the woods. But as they pushed through the underbrush, they could feel the darkness closing in around them, threatening to swallow them up and claim them forever. And still, they pressed on into the unknown, fighting for their humanity and for their lives. Chapter 61. Despite their victory, Samuel's former friends were left shaken by the intensity of the previous night's events. They stumbled through the dense woods, trying to find their way back to civilization. The trees loomed large and foreboding, their leaves casting eerie shadows on the ground. The air grew colder, and the group could hear the distant rumble of thunder. They quickened their pace, eager to escape the unsettling atmosphere of the woods. As they walked, Samantha stumbled and fell to the ground, clutching her ankle in pain. The group gathered around her, trying to help her up. But as they touched her, something strange happened. Samantha's skin began to turn black and slimy, and her eyes rolled back into her head. The group recoiled in horror as Samantha began to convulse, her body writhing on the ground. Panic set in as the others realized that Samantha had been infected by whatever had attacked them in the woods. They tried to back away, but it was too late. Samantha's body began to contort and twist, growing larger and more grotesque by the second. She let out a blood-curdling scream, and the group scattered in terror. Somehow they managed to make it back to their car, but the horror followed them. As they drove away, they could see the twisted, monstrous figure pursuing them through the woods, its eyes glowing with a malevolent energy. Shaken and terrified, the group realized that they were not safe, and that the darkness had not yet released them from its grip. They vowed to continue their fight, to find a way to destroy the darkness and rid themselves of the curse once and for all. But they knew that the battle would be long and difficult, and that they could never let their guard down again. The darkness was always waiting, always watching, and always hungry for new victims. Chapter 62. Samuel and the remaining members of his former friend group ran as fast as they could through the dense woods, their hearts pounding with fear and adrenaline. Samantha's twisted body was still pursuing them, her movements jerky and unnatural, her eyes glowing with an intense hunger. As they stumbled through the underbrush, the group could hear her disjointed voice calling out to them, promising power and riches beyond their wildest dreams. But they all knew that her words were nothing but lies, meant to lure them into her clutches. Suddenly, they burst out of the woods and onto a dirt road, gasping for breath. They could see the lights of a nearby town in the distance, and they knew that they had to reach it if they were going to survive. They ran towards the town, with Samantha's twisted form still chasing after them. But as they drew closer to the edge of the town, something strange began to happen. Samantha's twisted body started to contort and twist even more, her skin rippling and stretching, until it seemed as though she was about to tear apart. And then, all at once, she exploded into a cloud of black smoke. The group stood there in shock, staring at the spot where Samantha had been just moments before. They couldn't believe that she was gone, and they didn't know what to do next. But then Samuel spoke up, his voice shaking with emotion. "We can't let this stop us," he said. "We have to keep going, no matter what. We have to find some way to fight back against the darkness and the monsters that lurk in it." The rest of the group nodded in agreement, and they all set off towards the town. They didn't know what they would find there, but they knew that they had to keep going, no matter how terrifying the journey might be. Chapter 63. Samuel and his former friend group traveled for days, seeking shelter and safety from the darkness that followed them. However, as they delved deeper into the unknown, they couldn't shake off the feeling that something was amiss. They could feel the presence of the darkness all around them, lurking in the shadows and watching their every move. One night, as they made camp in an abandoned building, they heard a strange noise coming from the darkness. It sounded like the cry of a baby, but it was distorted and twisted. Samuel's former friends urged him to leave, but he couldn't ignore the call for help. He ventured into the darkness, following the sound until he came across a small, run-down house. Inside he found a small child, crying and alone. He picked up the child and tried to leave, but the doors were locked, and the windows wouldn't budge. Samuel was trapped in the darkness with the child, paranoia creeping in as he realized he was being watched. The darkness began to whisper to him, promising him power and control if he gave in to its temptations. Samuel felt a surge of fear and anger, struggling to hold on to his sanity as the darkness consumed him. He knew that if he stayed, the darkness would take him and the child, but he couldn't leave the small, innocent child behind. The night dragged on, and Samuel's former friends searched for him, knowing they could not leave him behind. As they neared the house, they heard Samuel's screams and cries for help. They rushed in, fighting against the darkness and its twisted creatures, to find Samuel standing over the child, his eyes glazed over with a malevolent glow. Samuel turned to his former friends, his twisted smile sending shivers down their spines. They knew then that they were no longer dealing with a friend, but with a monster bred from the darkness itself. The battle for their survival had only just begun. Chapter 64. As Samuel's former friends fought against him and the darkness, they realized that they were hopelessly outnumbered. Samuel's transformation had made him seemingly invincible, and the darkness around them was growing stronger by the minute. They fought with everything they had, but it seemed like it was all for naught. One by one, the members of the group were taken down by the creatures of the darkness, until only two remained, Melissa and Jack. Melissa was too scared to move, but Jack refused to give up. He reminded himself of all the times that he and Samuel had laughed and joked together, and he refused to give up hope that there was still some shred of his former friend left in there somewhere. He called out to Samuel, begging him to come back to them. At first there was no response, but then Jack saw something flicker in Samuel's eyes. He could see the struggle happening inside him, and he knew that he had to keep pushing if there was any chance of breaking through the darkness that had consumed him. And then suddenly, it was over. The darkness vanished, and Samuel was lying on the ground panting and sweating, but back to his normal self. The group didn't waste any time celebrating. They knew that they needed to get as far away from there as possible, before anything else happened. As they walked, they could all feel the weight of what had happened settling in on them. They had seen things that they couldn't explain, and they had lost friends along the way. But they were alive. And they were together. And that was all that mattered. Chapter 65. In the aftermath of the battle against the darkness, Samuel and his friends were left battered and shaken. They huddled together in the small abandoned cabin they had found, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Samuel was filled with guilt over what he had become, but Jack reassured him that it wasn't his fault. They knew that the darkness was still out there, waiting for its next victim. They decided to continue their journey, determined to find a way to defeat the darkness once and for all. They traveled through barren landscapes and dodged obstacles, staying on the move to avoid any potential danger. As night fell, they stumbled upon a small village. The village was eerily quiet and almost deserted, but they could feel the presence of the darkness lurking in the shadows. They knew they couldn't stay there for long, but they needed to find a safe place to rest. They cautiously made their way to a small inn and asked for a room. The innkeeper looked at them skeptically, before reluctantly giving them a key. Once they were inside the room, Samuel and his friends began barricading the door. They could hear strange noises outside, and they knew they weren't safe. Suddenly, there was a loud thud at the door. Samuel's heart raced as he heard the sound of scratching and clawing at the wood. They were under attack. Samuel and his friends drew their weapons and prepared to fight. The darkness had found them once again, and they knew they were in for a long night. As the door finally gave way, and the darkness poured into the room, Samuel and his friends braced themselves for the worst. They were determined to fight until the bitter end, no matter what horrors lay ahead. The battle had only just begun, and the lovers of dark humor were in for their biggest challenge yet. Chapter 66. The darkness had descended upon the small village like a thick blanket, muffling any sounds and obscuring any light. Samuel and his friends had barricaded themselves inside the inn, frantically searching for any means of defense. The walls shook as the creatures clawed at them from outside, and the group huddled together, their weapons at the ready. It was a long and grueling night. The creatures of the darkness seemed to be endless, their numbers never dwindling. Samuel and his friends fought with every ounce of strength they had, but it seemed as though they were losing ground with each passing minute. As the sun began to rise, the creatures retreated, leaving behind a trail of destruction in their wake. Samuel and his friends were battered and bruised, but alive. "We need to figure out a plan," Jack said, his voice hoarse from shouting and fighting. We can't keep running and hiding forever. Samuel nodded in agreement. We need to find the source of this darkness and destroy it, once and for all. The group set out with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to end the darkness once and for all. The journey was treacherous and filled with danger, but they pushed on, their determination unwavering. Days turned into weeks and the group faced countless obstacles, each one putting their skills and their faith to the test. They battled monsters, traversed treacherous terrain, and pushed their bodies to the limit. But through it all, their resolve never faltered. And then, finally, they found it. The source of the darkness. And it was far worse than anything they could have ever imagined. Samuel and his companions stood in front of a gaping chasm, the darkness swirling and pulsing within it like a living thing. They could hear whispers and moans coming from deep within, and the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. This was it. The final battle. Samuel took a deep breath, tightening his grip on his weapon. "We're going in," he said, his voice steady. And with that, the group descended into the depths of the darkness, ready to face whatever horrors awaited them. Chapter 67. Samuel and his companions made their way down the chasm, the pulsing darkness growing stronger with each step. The air was thick and choking, filled with the putrid scent of decay. The walls of the chasm seemed to breathe, and Samuel felt as though the darkness was alive and watching them. As they drew nearer to the heart of the darkness, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble, and the pulsing grew more intense. Something was stirring, and it was not pleased. Suddenly, a massive creature rose up from the darkness before them. It was a twisted, malformed thing with razor-sharp claws and teeth like daggers. Its eyes glowed with an unholy light, and its breath was foul. Samuel and his companions drew their weapons and prepared for battle. They knew that this was the final test, the last stand against the darkness. The battle was fierce and bloody. The creature was relentless, slashing at them with its claws and battering them with its huge muscular body. Samuel and his companions fought on, their weapons flashing in the dark, their hearts filled with courage and determination. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the creature fell. Samuel and his companions stood panting and bleeding, surrounded by the pulsing darkness. But they knew that they had won. The darkness began to recede, and slowly, the chasm filled with light. Samuel and his companions turned to face each other, exhaustion and relief etched on their faces. "We did it," Samuel said, his voice shaky with emotion. "We beat the darkness." His companions nodded, their eyes filled with gratitude and respect. Together, they had faced the ultimate evil and emerged victorious. But as they looked around at the still burning embers of the darkness, they knew that their journey was far from over. There was still work to be done, still battles to be fought. And they were ready for whatever lay ahead. Chapter 68. As Samuel and his companions emerged from the chasm, they were met with an eerie silence. The darkness that had been consuming everything in its path was now gone. The group felt victorious, relieved to have conquered the darkness, but they knew it wasn't over yet. "We did it," said Jack, wiping sweat from his forehead. "We actually did it." Samuel nodded, but his mind was still reeling from the battle. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of something much larger and more ominous. Just then, they heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. They tensed, ready to fight again if necessary, but out stepped a figure they never expected to see again. It was one of Samuel's old friends, the one who had first introduced him to the world of dark humor. He looked different now, almost unrecognizable. He was gaunt, his eyes sunken in and glazed over. "Samuel," he croaked, his voice barely audible. "You have to listen to me. You have to come with me." As Samuel stepped forward, his friend collapsed to the ground, his body racked with spasms. Samuel knelt beside him, trying to ease his pain, but it was too late. His friend was gone. Samuel felt a chill run down his spine as he looked around at his companions. They all wore the same expression of fear and uncertainty. They knew that whatever was coming next would be worse than anything they had faced before. "We have to keep going," said Samuel, his voice shaking. We can't let this defeat us. Together, the group set off again, their determination to survive stronger than ever before. They didn't know what lay ahead, but they were ready to face it head-on. The darkness may have been defeated, but there was still a long road ahead of them. Chapter 69. Samuel and his companions continued on their journey, haunted by the memory of their fallen friend. They walked for hours in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. But as the sun began to set, Samuel's senses suddenly sharpened. There was something in the air, a feeling of dread. He could feel it in his bones. He turned to his companions, his eyes wide with fear. "Do you feel that?" he whispered. They nodded silently, their expressions mirroring his own. As they walked, the trees around them began to twist and warp, their branches turning into gnarled claws. The sky darkened, and a cold wind began to howl through the woods. The hairs on Samuel's arms stood on end. They stumbled through the forest, their path twisting and turning in a chaotic dance. Samuel's heart raced, and he could hear his own ragged breath in his ears. He was sure they were lost, that they would never make it out of this forest alive. And then, suddenly, they broke through the trees and into a clearing. In front of them stood a massive stone archway, its surface covered in strange runes and symbols. Samuel's heart sank. He knew what this was. He had seen it before in his nightmares. The gateway. He turned to his companions, his voice shaking. "We have to go through there," he said. "It's the only way." They nodded, eyes wide with fear. Samuel took a deep breath and stepped through the archway. As he emerged on the other side, he saw a world unlike any he had ever known. The sky was a sickening green, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of slime. In the distance, he could see twisted towers of black stone, surrounded by a sea of writhing tentacles. And in the center of it all, a figure stood. It was unlike anything Samuel had ever seen. It was a mass of writhing tentacles and gaping maws, its form constantly shifting and twisting. It radiated a cold, malevolent power, and Samuel knew that they had found the source of the darkness. His companions stood beside him, their weapons at the ready. They knew what they had to do. They charged forward, their screams swallowed up by the roar of the creature. The battle was fierce, and Samuel's mind went numb as he fought for his life. But he knew deep down that they had to win. There was no other way. And then, suddenly, the creature let out a final, ear-splitting shriek, and it was done. The darkness receded, and the world around Samuel slowly returned to normal. He looked around, dazed, wondering if it had all been a nightmare. But he knew deep down that he had faced something truly terrifying. He had stared into the abyss, and it had stared back. And he knew that he would never be the same again. Chapter 70. Samuel and his companions emerged from the chasm, battered and bruised, but with a sense of accomplishment. They had faced their fear and emerged victorious. As they walked away from the chasm, Samuel felt a weight lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he felt light-hearted. As they trekked through the forest, they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center was a small cottage with smoke billowing from the chimney. They cautiously approached the door, but it opened before they had a chance to knock. An old woman with kind eyes and a warm smile greeted them and invited them in. The cottage was cozy and filled with the aroma of baked goods. The old woman offered them tea and freshly baked cookies. Samuel and his companions sat around the table, chatting and laughing as if they had not a care in the world. As they finished their treats, the old woman told them stories of her youth, filled with adventure and wonder. Samuel felt his heart fill with joy as he listened to her tales. For the first time since they had set out on their journey, Samuel felt like he was truly alive. As the night wore on, the old woman bid them good night and sent them off with a warm hug. Samuel and his companions walked away from the cottage, feeling revitalized and rejuvenated. They no longer feared the darkness that lay ahead, for they knew that there was light in the world as well. Samuel smiled as he walked, feeling a warmth in his chest that he had not felt in a long time. For the first time in a long time, Samuel was happy. Chapter 71. As they left the old woman's cottage, Samuel felt an overwhelming sense of dread. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the woman and her stories. His companions, on the other hand, were jovial and excited, talking about how the tea and cookies had made them feel refreshed and energized. As they walked through the forest, the trees began to thin out and the ground became damp and marshy. The air grew thick and humid, making it hard to breathe. Samuel noticed that his companions were struggling as well, but they didn't seem to notice the change in the atmosphere. Suddenly, they heard a loud, piercing scream that echoed through the trees. Samuel's heart raced as he recognized the voice. It was the old woman from the cottage. They ran towards the sound and found her lying on the ground, her body twisted and broken. As they approached her, they saw movement out of the corner of their eyes. They turned to see a group of pale, emaciated figures emerge from the darkness, their eyes glowing red. Without warning, the figures attacked. Samuel and his companions fought back, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. The creatures had razor-sharp claws and teeth like daggers, and they moved with an inhuman speed and agility. Despite their best efforts, Samuel and his companions were slowly being overpowered. Samuel felt hot blood pour down his face as one of the creatures slashed him with its claws. He saw his companions fall one by one, their screams echoing through the forest. As Samuel lay on the ground, barely conscious, he saw the creatures converge on him, their glowing red eyes fixed on him like a predator on its prey. He knew that this was it, the end of his journey. But as the creatures closed in, a bright light enveloped him, and he felt himself being lifted up and away. When the light faded, Samuel found himself in a dark, unfamiliar place. He didn't know where he was or what had happened to him. All he knew was that he was alone, and that the darkness around him seemed to stretch on forever. Chapter 72. Samuel awoke to darkness. His head felt heavy and his body ached all over, but he tried to push through the pain. He could hear whispers in the distance, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. Slowly his vision began to adjust to the darkness, and he saw that he was in a large room, surrounded by chains and cages. He looked around for his companions, but he was alone. Panic set in as he struggled against the chains, but they held fast. Suddenly, he heard a cackling laughter that made him shiver. The whispers grew louder, and he could make out the words. They were talking about him, discussing his fate. Samuel closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He didn't know where he was or who had taken him, but he knew he had to find a way out. He kept listening to the whispers, trying to glean any information he could. As time passed, Samuel began to hear footsteps approaching. The footsteps grew louder, and soon a hooded figure appeared before him. Samuel couldn't see their face, but he could feel their malevolent gaze upon him. The hooded figure spoke. "Welcome, Samuel. It seems you've stumbled upon our little operation. A shame, really. We were hoping to keep this a secret." The figure chuckled, and Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you want from me?" Samuel asked, trying to sound confident despite his fear. "Nothing much, Samuel. Just a sacrifice to appease our Lord." "Your Lord?" The figure nodded. "Yes. The one who controls the darkness. The one who has given us the power to do his bidding." Samuel tried to take in what the figure was saying, but it all sounded insane. He knew he had to get out of there, before it was too late. Suddenly, the figure lunged forward, and Samuel felt a sharp pain in his arm. He looked down to see a needle sticking out of his skin. And he could feel himself growing weaker. The figure laughed and walked away, leaving Samuel alone in the darkness. As the drug took hold, Samuel's mind began to drift. He saw images of the hooded figures, the pale creatures, and the monstrous creature that they had fought. He saw the old woman's cottage, the forest, and the chasm. He saw his companions, and he knew that they were in danger. Samuel fought against the darkness, trying to stay conscious, but it was no use. He fell into a deep sleep, not knowing what would happen to him or his friends next. Chapter 73. Samuel slowly opened his eyes, the dim light in the room illuminating his surroundings. He tried to move his arms and legs, but they were bound tight by the chains that restrained him. Panic set in as he realized he was still captive to those hooded figures, their glowing red eyes watching him from the shadows. A sudden noise caught his attention, and he strained to look in the direction of the sound. He saw a figure approaching, their steps echoing ominously in the small room. As they drew closer, Samuel recognized the hooded figure from before, the one who had injected him with the drug that had knocked him out. The figure unlocked the chains holding Samuel in place, helping him to his feet. Samuel's legs were shaky as he took a few tentative steps, grateful for the escape from the tight restraints. "You're awake." "Good," the figure said, their voice devoid of any emotion. "The Lord has a task for you." Samuel felt a chill run down his spine at the mention of the mysterious Lord. He had seen enough horror movies to know that nothing good could come from being summoned by a dark entity. "What task?" Samuel asked, trying to keep his voice steady, despite the fear bubbling inside him. "You will accompany us on a journey," the figure answered cryptically. "To a place where the Lord's power is strongest. We will make a sacrifice in His honor, and you will bear witness to His glory." Samuel tried to resist, but the figure grabbed him forcefully by the arm, dragging him out of the room and into a labyrinth of dark hallways. They passed by cages and cells, filled with people who looked just as terrified as Samuel felt. Finally, they arrived at a large chamber, the center dominated by an altar adorned with strange symbols and ancient artifacts. Samuel felt a sense of dread wash over him, instinctively knowing that this was the place where the Lord's power manifested. The hooded figures began chanting in a language that Samuel had never heard before, their voices rising in unison as they moved around the altar. Samuel watched in horror as they gestured to him, forcing him to step forward and kneel in front of the altar. He felt a sharp pain in his chest as one of the figures plunged a knife deep into his heart. Samuel's vision began to blur as he heard the hooded figures continue their chant, their voices growing louder and more frenzied by the second. Just as he thought his life was about to end, Samuel saw a flash of light, followed by the sound of an explosion. His body was thrown backward as the chamber shook violently, the figures around him screaming in panic and confusion. As Samuel's consciousness faded, he caught a glimpse of the figure that had helped him escape, their hood falling back to reveal a face he never expected to see again. It was the werewolf he had encountered in the abandoned hospital, eyes blazing with a fierce determination to protect him. Samuel knew that his journey wasn't over yet. There was still much to fear, but he also knew that he had allies he could rely on. The lovers of dark humor had become something more than a group of twisted friends. They were now a family, bound together by the horrors they had endured and the courage they had gained. Samuel closed his eyes, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. He was ready for whatever came next, knowing that he wouldn't face it alone. Chapter 74. Samuel gasped for breath as he lay on the cold stone floor. His heart was pounding in his chest and he could feel the sweat beading on his forehead. He looked around the room and saw that he was alone. He tried to sit up and immediately felt the tug of the chains that bound him to the wall. He pulled at them, but they were too strong. He was trapped. Suddenly, he heard a soft growling noise. He looked up and saw the werewolf standing in front of him, its eyes glowing in the darkness. Samuel felt a surge of relief wash over him. The werewolf began to sniff around the room, its nose twitching as it searched for a way to free Samuel. Suddenly, it stopped and let out a low growl. Samuel looked in the direction the werewolf was facing and saw a hooded figure approaching. He tensed, not sure whether the figure was friend or foe. As the figure drew closer, Samuel saw that it was the same one who had injected him with the drug. He felt a surge of anger and fear. The figure raised its arm, and Samuel braced himself for the worst. But suddenly, the werewolf leaped forward and knocked the figure to the ground. Samuel watched as the two figures struggled on the ground, their movements a blur in the darkness. He heard the sound of snapping bones and tearing flesh, and knew that the werewolf was fighting for his life. Finally the struggle ceased and the werewolf stood up, its fur matted with blood. It looked over at Samuel and let out a mournful howl. Samuel felt a pang of sadness for the creature. It had saved him once again, but at what cost? He heard a noise behind him and turned to see a hooded figure approaching. He tensed, ready to fight, but the figure just knelt down beside him and began to undo the chains. Samuel felt a surge of hope. Maybe he would get out of this alive, after all. Chapter 75. Samuel stumbled out of the room, his heart racing. He could hear the sounds of the hooded figures behind him as they chased after him, their footsteps pounding against the stone floor. He had to keep moving, he had to find a way out of this place. He ran down a long, winding corridor, the flickering torches on the walls casting eerie shadows around him. The air was thick with the stench of death and decay, and Samuel struggled to keep from gagging. He had to keep going, he had to escape. As he turned a corner, Samuel saw a glimmer of light up ahead. He ran towards it, his heart pounding in his chest. As he drew closer, he saw that it was a doorway, the bright light spilling out into the otherwise dark corridor. Without hesitation, Samuel ran through the doorway and found himself standing in a large room. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were rows and rows of jars filled with strange glowing objects. Samuel had never seen anything like it before. As he looked around the room, he saw that there was a man standing in the corner. The man was dressed in tattered robes, his long white hair falling around his face in wild curls. He looked ancient, and there was a madness in his eyes that made Samuel feel uneasy. "What is this place?" Samuel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man laughed, a low guttural sound that echoed through the room. "This is my collection," he said. "The fruits of my labor, the rewards of my sacrifices." Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. He realized that he was standing in the presence of a madman, and that his chances of survival were slim. He turned to run, but it was too late. The man had grabbed him by the arm, his grip like iron. "You cannot escape," the man hissed. "You are mine, now and forever." Samuel struggled, but it was no use. He knew that he was trapped, and that his fate was sealed. The man's grip tightened, and Samuel felt the world go dark around him. Chapter 76. Samuel tried to make sense of his surroundings, but the room was a blur of flashing lights and grotesque objects. The madman cackled as he approached Samuel with a sharp instrument in hand. Samuel's heart raced as he struggled against his restraints. But the chains only tightened around him. The madman leaned in closer, his breath hot and humid against Samuel's ear. "You thought you could escape your fate, boy. You thought you could outrun the keepers?" His voice was laced with venom. Samuel tried to speak, but his words were muffled by the gag in his mouth. He watched in terror as the madman began to carve strange symbols into his flesh. But just when Samuel thought his fate was sealed, a deafening howl echoed through the room. The madman looked up, startled, as a massive werewolf burst through the door and lunged at him. The two figures clashed in a flurry of fur and blood, with Samuel watching on in horror. The werewolf was fierce, its claws ripping through the madman's flesh like paper. But even as the madman writhed in agony, he managed to grab a nearby object and strike the werewolf with a sickening thud. For a moment, the room fell silent. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the werewolf stumble backwards, wounded. But then, as if determined to protect Samuel at all costs, the werewolf let out another fierce howl and charged at the madman once again. Samuel watched in awe as the two figures fought, their movements dizzying and impossible to follow. But as the fight dragged on, Samuel realized with horror that he was not the only one trapped in this nightmarish world. A faint whimpering sound filled the room, and Samuel turned to see a young girl huddled in a corner. She was barely conscious, her eyes wide with fear. With renewed determination, Samuel struggled against his chains once again. He knew he would not be able to escape without help. But he also knew that he couldn't leave this innocent girl behind. As the werewolf continued to fight, Samuel locked eyes with the girl and promised himself that he would do everything in his power to protect her. He only hoped that he wouldn't have to pay the ultimate price for his newfound courage. Chapter 77. Samuel helped the young girl out of the room, and looked for a way out of the abandoned mental institution. He could hear the hooded figures getting closer as they searched for him. The girl clung to his hand tightly as they ran down the dark corridors. Finally, they came across an old elevator, and Samuel frantically pressed the button. It took a few seconds before the elevator doors finally opened, and they stepped inside. Samuel hit the button for the ground floor, and the elevator jolted to life. As they descended, Samuel could feel the tension in his body start to ease. But as soon as the elevator doors opened, the hooded figures were waiting for them. Samuel and the young girl were cornered with no way out. One of the hooded figures stepped forward and pulled back their hood, revealing a familiar face. It was one of Samuel's old friends from their dark humor group. He had always been a little more twisted than the others, but Samuel never suspected him of being a part of the Keepers of the Dark. "You should have never come here, Samuel," his friend said with a sinister smile. Samuel felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He didn't know what to do. But then, the werewolf burst out of the shadows and attacked the hooded figures. Samuel grabbed the young girl's hand and ran out of the mental institution as fast as they could. The werewolf kept the hooded figures at bay as they made their escape. As they ran down the street, Samuel realized that he couldn't go back to his old life. He had to find a way to stop the Keepers of the Dark once and for all. And he knew that he couldn't do it alone. Chapter 78. As Samuel and his companions sprinted through the dark forest, he couldn't help but feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had never been so scared in his life. The hooded figures were relentless in their pursuit, their shadowy forms closing in on Samuel and his group. Just as they were about to be overtaken, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was a woman, with wild hair and a crazed look in her eyes. She held a large knife in one hand, and a decapitated head in the other. Samuel and his companions hesitated, unsure of whether to trust this new stranger. But then the woman spoke. "Don't be afraid," she said, her voice calm and soothing. "I'm not one of them. I'm here to help you." Samuel felt a sense of relief wash over him. He knew he couldn't fight off the hooded figures on his own, and this new ally might just be the key to their salvation. The woman led them deeper into the forest, dodging trees and leaping over rocks with ease. Samuel couldn't help but feel amazed at her agility, despite the grisly scene from earlier. As they ran, the woman explained that she too had been targeted by the Keepers of the Dark. She had been living in hiding for months, waiting for the right moment to strike back. "I may be crazy," she admitted with a twisted smile, "but that doesn't mean I can't be useful." Samuel and his companions continued to run, with the woman leading the way. They were exhausted, but knew they couldn't stop until they were safe. Suddenly, the woman stopped in her tracks. "We're here," she said, gesturing towards a small cabin in the clearing. Samuel peered through the darkness, and saw that the cabin was surrounded by a barrier of glowing symbols. He recognized them from his time in the mental institution. They were the same symbols the madman had been carving into his flesh. The woman led them inside, and they collapsed onto the floor. Samuel couldn't believe they had made it this far. "You should rest," the woman said, handing them each a glass of water. "You still have a long way to go." Samuel knew that she was right. They still had to find a way to stop the Keepers of the Dark once and for all, and to do that, they would need all the help they could get. Chapter 79. Samuel and his companions woke up to the sound of a scuffle outside the cabin. They grabbed their weapons and peeked through the window, only to see the woman with the decapitated head engaged in a fierce battle with a group of hooded figures. Without hesitation, Samuel and his friends rushed outside to help the woman. They fought fiercely against the hooded figures, but they seemed to be outnumbered. Just when things were looking bleak, a pack of werewolves appeared out of nowhere and joined the fray. The hooded figures were no match for the combined strength of Samuel's group and the werewolves. One by one they fell to the ground, lifeless. Once the dust settled, the group approached the woman with the decapitated head, who had somehow managed to hold her own against the hooded figures. She turned to them, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I owe you my life," she said, her voice trembling. "I never thought I would make it out of that hellhole alive." Samuel and his friends exchanged confused glances. "What hellhole?" he asked. The woman sighed. "The mental institution," she said. "I was a patient there, before they took me and used me for their twisted experiments." Samuel's heart sank. They had been fighting for a cause they didn't fully understand. But now, with the woman's help, they had a clearer picture of what they were up against. "We need to find their headquarters," Samuel said, determined. "We need to put an end to this." The woman nodded, her eyes blazing with fury. "I know where it is," she said. "And I'll help you get there." With a newfound sense of purpose, Samuel and his companions set out into the dark forest, following the woman with the decapitated head. They knew the road ahead would be treacherous, but they were prepared to face whatever horrors awaited them. Chapter 80. Samuel and his companions followed the woman's instructions and arrived at the headquarters of the Keepers of the Dark. The building was a massive, dilapidated mansion, with ivy covering the walls and a large metal gate at the entrance. They could hear faint chanting coming from the inside, and the smell of incense filled the air. Samuel took a deep breath and looked at his friends. They all nodded, knowing that this was their chance to put an end to the twisted organization. They pushed open the gate and stepped inside the mansion. The interior was even more menacing than the exterior. The walls were covered in occult symbols, and candles flickered in every corner. A group of hooded figures stood at the end of the hallway, chanting in unison. Samuel and his companions drew their weapons and charged forward. They clashed with the hooded figures, throwing punches and dodging knives. The smell of blood filled the air as they fought their way through the mansion. Finally, they reached the main chamber. The Keepers of the Dark were gathered in a circle, performing a dark ritual. Samuel recognized the madman who had been carving symbols into his flesh, and the woman they had saved from the mental institution. Samuel stepped forward, his voice ringing out in the silence. "Your twisted games stop here. We know about your experiments. We know about the lives you've destroyed." The Keepers of the Dark laughed, their eyes glowing with malice. "You think you can stop us? You fools. We are the Keepers of the Dark. We are the masters of the occult. You are nothing." Suddenly, the candles flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. Samuel felt hands closing around his throat, squeezing the life out of him. He struggled to breathe as the hooded figures closed in, their eyes glowing like embers. Just when it seemed that all was lost, a figure burst into the room. It was the woman with the decapitated head and the large knife. She raised her blade and charged forward, slicing through the hooded figures with ease. Samuel gasped for air as the woman lowered her knife. "We did it," he breathed. But the woman shook her head. "This is only the beginning," she said. "There are other groups like this one. We have to find them and stop them too." Samuel nodded, knowing that there was still much work to be done. But for now, he was just grateful to be alive. Chapter 81. As Samuel and his companions catch their breath, they look around the room, taking in the sight of the fallen hooded figures and the remnants of the dark ritual. The woman with the decapitated head stands in front of them, her eyes blazing with an intensity that sends shivers down Samuel's spine. "Who the hell are you?" Samuel demands, clutching the knife he had taken from one of the hooded figures. The woman cocks her head to the side, a gesture that makes her look even more disturbing. "I am the guardian of the dark," she says in a low voice. "And I have been sent to aid you in your fight against the Keepers." Samuel exchanges a glance with his companions, all of whom look just as confused and disturbed as he feels. "Why would you help us?" he asks. The woman gives him a small smile, a gesture that looks out of place on her decapitated head. "Because I know what it's like to be trapped in the dark," she says. "And I know what it's like to be hunted." Without warning, the woman lunges forward, her knife flashing in the dim light. Samuel raises his own weapon defensively, but she doesn't attack him. Instead, she slices the ropes that bind the woman they had saved from the mental institution, freeing her from her captivity. "Come on," the woman with the decapitated head says, gesturing toward the door. "We have to leave before more of them show up." Samuel and his companions follow the woman out of the room, careful to step over the fallen bodies of the hooded figures. They emerge into a corridor that looks like something out of a horror movie, with peeling wallpaper and flickering lights. As they move down the corridor, Samuel can't shake the feeling that they are being watched. He keeps his senses alert, ready to defend himself and his friends if necessary. And then, suddenly, they are in the open air, the night sky spreading out above them like a blanket of black velvet. Samuel looks around, disoriented, until he realizes that they are standing on the roof of the mansion. "How did we get up here?" he asks, turning to the woman with the decapitated head. She just smiles at him enigmatically. "Magic," she says. "Now come on. We have to keep moving." Without another word, she leads them across the sloping roof, down a ladder, and into the darkness beyond. Samuel and his companions follow her, unsure of what the future holds, but determined to see this fight through to the end. Chapter 82. Samuel and his companions followed the woman with the decapitated head as she led them to the roof of the mansion. They were surprised to find a helicopter waiting for them, but they didn't question it. The woman gestured for them to get inside, and they did so hurriedly. As the helicopter ascended, Samuel looked down at the mansion and saw the hooded figures gathering below. He knew they would stop at nothing to get revenge for the defeat of their dark ritual. As they flew away from the mansion, a sudden gust of wind caused the helicopter to shake violently. Samuel and his companions held onto their seats, fearing the worst. Suddenly, the woman with the decapitated head began to convulse and thrash about. Her head rolled off her shoulders and onto the floor, her body falling limp. Samuel and his companions screamed in terror as the headless body writhed and squirmed, like something out of a nightmare. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. The woman's head, which had been lying on the floor, began to speak. Her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light as she addressed Samuel and his companions. "You fools," she hissed. "Did you really believe you could defeat the Keepers of the Dark so easily? You have only delayed the inevitable. The darkness will consume you all, one by one." Samuel and his companions were frozen with fear as the head spoke. They didn't know what to do or who to trust anymore. The helicopter continued to shake and rattle, threatening to break apart at any moment. Suddenly, the headless body sprang to life again, lunging at Samuel and his companions with terrifying speed and agility. They struggled to fight it off, but it was too strong, too fast. Samuel felt a cold breath on the back of his neck as the headless body closed in for the kill. Just when all seemed lost, the helicopter burst through a thick cloud cover and into the clear blue skies beyond. The headless body fizzled out of existence, and the head fell silent. Samuel and his companions breathed a collective sigh of relief, but they knew that the horror wasn't over yet. The Keepers of the Dark were still out there, waiting for their chance to strike again. Chapter 83. The helicopter shook violently as the headless body and the decapitated head attacked them. Samuel and his companions screamed in terror as they tried to fight it off, but to no avail. The woman with the decapitated head tried to intervene, but a force seemed to hold her back. Finally, Samuel managed to pull out his gun and shoot the headless body, causing it to explode into a cloud of dust. The head, however, continued to float in the air, emitting a sinister laughter. The woman with the decapitated head reached out and grabbed it, squeezing it until it burst into pieces. "That was just a trick," she said, wiping the blood off her hands. "The Keepers of the Dark are masters of illusion." Samuel and his companions groaned in disbelief. They had been through so much, and now they were being toyed with again. "Now what?" Emily asks, her voice trembling with fear. "Now we go back to our lives and pretend that nothing happened," Joshua said, his face pale and sweaty. Samuel shook his head. "No, we can't just forget about this. We have to do something." We have to expose the keepers of the dark, and make sure they never hurt anyone again. The woman with the decapitated head nodded. I agree. But you have to be careful. The keepers are powerful, and they won't let you ruin their plans easily. Samuel took a deep breath and looked at his friends. They were all scared and exhausted, but he knew they were also determined to see this through. We'll do whatever it takes, he said, his voice strong and resolute. We've come too far to back down now. The woman with the decapitated head smiled. I knew you were the right people for this job. Follow me, and I'll show you what you need to do next. The helicopter flew into the night, carrying Samuel and his companions to an uncertain future. They didn't know what the next step would be, or how much more they would have to sacrifice to stop the keepers of the dark. All they knew was that they had each other, and the determination to see justice done. Chapter 84. Samuel and his companions were exhausted from the battle against the illusionary headless body and decapitated head. The shock of the keeper's abilities had left them shaky and uncertain. They couldn't help but wonder if the keepers had more tricks up their sleeves. As they stumbled out of the helicopter, they were greeted by a group of armed men. The leader, a burly man with a harsh voice, demanded to know their business. Samuel tried to explain their situation, but the man only sneered. I've heard enough of your nonsense. You're trespassing on private property, and we have orders to shoot anyone who does so. Samuel and his companions exchanged worried glances. They had heard rumors about the men who guarded the keeper's mansion, and they knew how ruthless they could be. Emily stepped forward, hoping to reason with the man. We're not here to cause trouble. We just need to get to the city. Please let us go. The man laughed. You really think I'm that stupid? You're not leaving here alive, my friends. Samuel and Emily exchanged a look. They knew they had to act fast before the situation turned deadly. Samuel took a step forward, hoping to distract the man while Emily made a run for it. But before he could say anything, a voice echoed through the night. Stand down, Sergeant. These people are with me. Samuel and his companions turned to see a tall figure emerging from the shadows. It was Isaac, the man who had helped them before. He walked towards them with a calm expression, his eyes fixed on the armed men who were now lowering their weapons. Isaac, thank God you're here, Samuel breathed a sigh of relief. Isaac nodded. I heard about your encounter at the mansion. It seems like you've stirred up quite a hornet's nest. Samuel and his companions nodded solemnly. They knew that the keepers would not take their interference lightly. We need to regroup and come up with a plan, Emily said. Isaac nodded again. Agreed. Follow me. They walked away from the gun-toting men and into the darkness. Samuel and his companions were still shaken by the events of the night, but they knew that they had to keep moving forward. They were determined to stop the keepers of the dark, no matter what the cost. Chapter 85. Samuel and his companions sat around a table in a small cafe, cups of coffee in front of them as they discussed their next move. We need to find that portal, but we have no idea where to start, Emily said, rubbing her forehead. We could try researching more about the history of the mansion. Maybe there are clues there, suggested Alex. Samuel nodded in agreement. And we need to be careful. The keepers know we're onto them now, and they won't take kindly to our investigation. Speaking of which, said Isaac, leaning forward, I have something to show you. He pulled out a small, old-fashioned key from his pocket and placed it on the table. This belonged to my grandfather, who was a researcher in the paranormal. He had a journal where he wrote about his findings, including a portal he discovered in the mountains. Where are these mountains? Asked Samuel eagerly. Isaac hesitated before answering. It's a dangerous place, Samuel. Not only because of the terrain, but because of the creatures that inhabit it. We'll take our chances, said Emily firmly. Very well, said Isaac, sliding the key toward Samuel. The journal is located in an old cabin at the base of the mountains. But be warned, it won't be an easy journey. As the group prepared to leave, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He looked around the cafe, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. He shrugged it off and followed his companions out the door. But as they walked down the street, Samuel saw a figure in the shadows, watching them with glowing red eyes. He froze in fear, but the others didn't seem to notice. He shook his head, thinking he was imagining things, and quickened his pace to catch up with them. Little did they know, they were being hunted by the Keepers of the Dark, who were determined to stop them from closing the portal and ending their reign of terror once and for all. Chapter 86. Samuel's heart raced as he watched the figure with glowing red eyes fade into the shadows. His mind was in a haze, and he couldn't help but feel his fear creeping up on him again. He turned to Emily and Isaac, but they didn't seem to have noticed anything. "Guys, I think we're being watched," Samuel said, trying to keep his voice calm. Isaac turned to him, his face stern and serious. "We have to keep moving. We can't stop until we find that portal and stop the Keepers." Emily nodded in agreement. "We need to find that journal too. It could be the key to our success." Samuel took a deep breath, trying to shake off his fear. "Okay, let's keep going then." They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing in the desolate streets. Every shadow looked like it held the creature with glowing red eyes. Samuel's palms were sweaty and his heart rate wouldn't slow down. Suddenly, they heard a sound from behind them. Samuel turned around, but there was nothing there. Just an empty street. He felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. They quickened their pace, but the sound continued, growing louder and more menacing. Then, suddenly, the figure with glowing red eyes appeared in front of them. It was unlike anything Samuel had ever seen. Its eyes glowed bright red, illuminating its twisted features. It was humanoid, but also very much not human. The creature let out a guttural growl, signaling its intent to attack. Isaac pulled out the potion they had found in the underground chamber, and threw it at the creature. It did nothing. The creature continued to growl and advance. Samuel, Emily, and Isaac stood their ground, determined to fight back. But they were no match for the Keepers of the Dark. The creature lunged forward and everything went black. When Samuel came to, he was alone. Emily and Isaac were gone. And he was in an unfamiliar place. He looked around, but nothing looked familiar. Then he saw it. Glowing red eyes in the darkness. The Keepers of the Dark had him now. Chapter 87. Samuel stood alone in the darkness, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. He had lost his friends in the chaos of the attack, and now he was stranded in this unfamiliar place with no idea of how to get back to civilization. He tried to shake off the fear that was growing inside him, but it clung to him like a choking vine. Samuel took a deep breath and tried to think. He knew he needed to find a way out of this place, and reunite with his friends. But as he turned to leave, he heard a sound that made his blood go cold. It was a low guttural growling sound, coming from somewhere in the darkness. Samuel froze, his heart racing as he tried to pinpoint the source of the noise. As he strained to listen, the growling grew louder and more intense, sending shivers down his spine. Samuel knew he couldn't stay here any longer. He had to find a way out before it was too late. He began to move cautiously through the woods, his heart hammering in his chest as he tried to stay silent and avoid drawing attention to himself. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something was stalking him through the trees. Suddenly, Samuel stumbled on a root and fell to the ground, his knees bruising on the rough earth. As he tried to regain his balance, he heard a rush of movement, and fear shot through him like a bolt of lightning. He looked up just in time to see a pair of glowing red eyes rushing towards him through the darkness, and Samuel knew that his worst nightmare was about to come true. Chapter 88. Samuel tried to run, but his feet were heavy as if they were made of lead. He turned his head to look at what was chasing him, but all he could see were the glowing red eyes getting closer and closer. He could hear its breathing getting louder with each passing second. Samuel tried to scream for help, but his voice was trapped in his throat. His heart was pounding so fast that he could feel it in his ears. He was running out of breath, and he knew he couldn't keep going for much longer. Suddenly, he tripped over a rock and fell to the ground. He hit his head on a tree root, and felt a sharp pain shoot through his body. He closed his eyes, waiting for the creature to attack him. But nothing happened. Cautiously, Samuel opened his eyes and looked around. He saw the creature standing a few feet away from him, its red eyes fixed on him. Its body was covered in black fur, and its long claws glinted in the moonlight. Samuel shuddered with fear as he realized that he was face to face with a werewolf. The creature let out a low growl, and Samuel knew he had to act fast. He tried to stand up, but his head was spinning and his legs were weak. He stumbled and fell again, his face inches away from the werewolf's snout. The werewolf opened its mouth, revealing its sharp teeth, and Samuel closed his eyes, ready for the end. But then he heard a voice. "Hey! Over here!" Samuel opened his eyes, and saw a figure standing a few yards away, waving its arms frantically. The werewolf turned its head to look at the person, and Samuel took advantage of the distraction to crawl away as fast as he could. He didn't stop until he was hiding behind a tree, gasping for breath. He looked back and saw the figure walking towards the werewolf, holding something shiny in its hand. It was Emily. Samuel felt relief flood his body as he realized that he was safe for the moment. But then he remembered that they were still being hunted by the Keepers of the Dark. He knew that they had to find the journal and the portal before it was too late. Samuel took a deep breath, picked himself up, and started walking towards Emily. He wasn't going to let the Keepers of the Dark win. Not this time. Chapter 89. Samuel and Emily ran through the forest, their breaths ragged and hearts pounding. They had narrowly escaped the werewolf, but they knew that they couldn't rest yet. The journal and portal were still out there, waiting to be found. As they hurried through the trees, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was as if the shadows themselves were alive with movement, following their every step. He tried to ignore it, to focus on their goal, but it was impossible. Finally, after what felt like hours, they stumbled upon a small cabin nestled in a clearing. It was old and weathered, but Samuel could see a faint light flickering inside. Without a word, he and Emily approached the door. Samuel tried the handle, but it was locked. He started to search for a way in, but before he could do anything, Emily hissed, "Samuel, look." He turned to follow her gaze, and saw a figure approaching from the trees. It was humanoid but not quite human, with skin that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. And its eyes, they glowed like the creature that had attacked them before, like the Keepers of the Dark. Samuel felt his breath catch in his throat as the figure drew closer. Emily took a step in front of him, her hands held out in front of her defensively. The creature stopped a few feet away, its glowing eyes fixed on them. For a moment, no one moved. Samuel could hear the sound of his own heart beating in his ears. Then, without warning, the creature lunged. Emily was ready for it, though. With a swift motion, she raised her hand and spoke a single word. There was a bright flash of light, and Samuel felt a wave of heat wash over him. When he opened his eyes again, the creature was gone. All that remained was a faint smoking patch of earth where it had stood. Samuel stared at Emily, his mouth open in disbelief. "How did you do that?" She smiled wryly. "Magic, Samuel. I told you, I come from a family of witches." He shook his head in wonder, then turned back to the cabin. "Come on," he said, and they approached the door once more. This time it opened easily at Samuel's touch. Inside, they found themselves in a small, cluttered room. There were shelves lining the walls, and books and papers strewn about. In the center of the room was a large wooden table, and on it sat an old journal. Samuel's heart leapt at the sight of it. This was what they had been searching for, the key to defeating the Keepers of the Dark. He grabbed the journal and flipped through the pages. It was filled with strange symbols and diagrams, but as he read, he felt a sense of understanding creeping over him. This was it. This was the information they needed. As they left the cabin and headed back into the forest, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. They had what they needed now, but it felt like they were still being watched, still being hunted. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see glowing eyes in the darkness. But there was nothing there. Just silence and shadows. And the looming threat of the keepers of the dark, waiting for them to make a mistake. Chapter 90. Samuel and Emily walked through the dense forest with the journal clutched tightly in their hands, trying to follow the directions written inside. The instructions were cryptic, but their desire to defeat the keepers of the dark gave them the courage to continue. As they walked, they heard rustling in the bushes and the snapping of twigs. They looked around but saw nothing. Emily whispered to Samuel, "Do you hear that?" Samuel nodded, his heart racing with fear. They quickened their pace, but the sounds seemed to follow them no matter where they went. Finally, they stumbled upon a clearing and found the portal they had been searching for. It was a circular stone structure with strange symbols etched into the sides. The portal glowed with a bluish light that seemed to beckon them closer. Samuel and Emily approached the portal, feeling both fear and excitement. Suddenly, they heard a deep guttural growl from behind them. They spun around and saw a massive, snarling werewolf. Its eyes glowed red in the dark, and its sharp fangs glinted in the moonlight. Emily reached into her backpack and pulled out a silver dagger. Samuel grabbed a nearby stick, trying to look confident despite his trembling hands. The werewolf lunged at them, but Emily dodged and plunged her dagger into its side. The werewolf howled in pain and turned to run away, leaving Samuel and Emily with a newfound sense of courage and determination. They approached the portal and read the instructions from the journal aloud. As they recited the ancient words, their surroundings began to change. The trees disappeared, the sky turned black, and the ground beneath their feet melted away. They felt as if they were falling into a black void, but soon they emerged in a strange new world. Samuel and Emily looked around in wonder at the bizarre landscape before them. They knew they had to stay vigilant, as they were now in the keeper's territory. But they had come too far to back down now. They clasped hands, determined to continue their mission and rid the world of the keepers of the dark forever. Chapter 91. As Samuel and Emily walked through the strange new world they found themselves in, they were both amazed by how peaceful it seemed. The sun was shining down on them, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming flowers. "This is definitely a change of pace from the abandoned mental institution," Samuel joked, breaking the silence between them. Emily chuckled. "Yeah, I think I prefer this to being chased by werewolves." They walked for what felt like hours, taking in the beauty of their surroundings. They talked about their lives before they met each other and shared childhood stories. As they walked, Samuel noticed a small village in the distance. "I think we should head towards that village," he said, pointing in the direction of the village. Emily nodded in agreement. "Yeah, we might be able to find some information about the keepers of the dark there." As they got closer to the village, they noticed that the people there seemed happy and carefree. They smiled and greeted Samuel and Emily as they walked by, making them feel welcomed. They stopped at a small marketplace, where they met an old man who seemed to know more about the keepers of the dark than they did. He told them stories about how the keepers had caused chaos in his village years ago, but were defeated by a group of brave warriors. Samuel and Emily listened intently, taking notes and hanging on to every word the old man said. After getting all the information they could, they left the marketplace and continued their journey. Samuel felt lighter and more optimistic than he had in a while. He was grateful to have met Emily, and happy that they were making progress in their mission. As they walked away from the village, the sun began to set in the distance, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. Samuel and Emily realized they needed to find a place to rest for the night. They stumbled upon a small inn nestled in the forest and decided to spend the night there. They were greeted by a friendly innkeeper who welcomed them with open arms. As they settled into their room, Samuel felt a sense of calm wash over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt safe. He knew they still had a long journey ahead of them, but for now, he was content to sit back, relax, and enjoy the peace and quiet. As he closed his eyes, Samuel whispered to himself, "We'll defeat the keepers of the dark. We'll make things right." Chapter 92. Samuel and Emily woke up to a beautiful sunrise, feeling refreshed and energized to continue their quest. They thanked the kind villagers for their hospitality, and set off to find the keepers of the dark. They walked through a dense forest, following the instructions from the old man, and finally arrived at an ancient temple. The temple was in ruins, its walls covered in moss and vines. Samuel and Emily cautiously entered the temple, their hearts racing with anticipation and fear. The air was thick with a musty smell, and the only light came from small crevices in the ceiling. As they walked deeper into the temple, Samuel heard a whispering voice in his ear. He turned around but found nothing but darkness. Emily noticed his unease and held his hand tightly, silently reassuring him. They finally reached a large chamber at the end of a long corridor. The chamber was dimly lit, but Samuel's eyes quickly adjusted to the darkness. The chamber was filled with ancient artifacts and an altar at the center. Suddenly, they heard a low growl, and the ground began to vibrate. They turned around to see a group of shadowy figures approaching them. The figures were hooded, and their faces were obscured in darkness. Samuel and Emily quickly realized that they were facing the keepers of the dark. They brandished their weapons, ready to fight for their lives. The keepers of the dark attacked them with a ferocity that Samuel and Emily had never seen before. The battle was fierce, and both sides were evenly matched. Just when it seemed like they were going to lose, Samuel remembered the ancient words that they had recited to enter the portal. He repeated the words with all his might, and a blinding light enveloped the chamber. The keepers of the dark let out blood-curdling screams as they were disintegrated in the light. Samuel and Emily collapsed on the ground, panting and exhausted. As the dust settled, they saw a glowing portal open up in front of them. Samuel and Emily knew that this was their chance to return home, but they also knew that their lives would never be the same again. They took one last look at the ancient temple, now devoid of life, and stepped into the portal. They emerged on the other side, dazed but unharmed. They hugged each other tightly, grateful to have survived the ordeal. They knew that they had witnessed things that most people couldn't even imagine, and that their love for dark humor had taken them to places beyond their wildest dreams. But one thing was for sure, they wouldn't be making any more jokes about monsters or the darkness. They had seen firsthand what could happen, and they knew that they had to be careful with the things they joked about. Samuel and Emily walked away from the portal, their hearts full of gratitude and newfound respect for the unknown. They knew that their adventure had come to an end, but they also knew that it was only the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. Chapter 93. The victory over the keepers of the dark was short-lived. The darkness they thought they had defeated was still around, lurking in the shadows. Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting for them. As they journeyed back through the peaceful new world, they noticed a subtle shift in the environment. The trees became twisted, the sky darkened, and the friendly villagers disappeared, replaced by eerie, faceless masks. Samuel and Emily realized they were no longer alone. They could hear whispers in the darkness, see movement out of the corners of their eyes, and feel the cold breath of something unseen on their necks. They tried to stay strong, but fear was creeping in. Samuel's heart raced as he realized they were being hunted. They didn't know what was chasing them, but they knew it was powerful and dangerous. As they walked, they stumbled upon an ancient graveyard, the headstones worn with age and adorned with strange symbols. Samuel felt a pull, as if something was calling them deeper into the graveyard. They found an open crypt, the scent of decay overwhelming. Inside they saw something they couldn't unsee. The walls were lined with preserved bodies, each one twisted and tortured in unspeakable ways. Samuel and Emily tried to back away, but they were pulled in by some unseen force. The ground shook, and the bodies began to stir. The haunting whispers grew louder, and the air grew thick with the scent of death. Suddenly, the bodies rose, their twisted limbs contorting as they rushed toward Samuel and Emily. They tried to run, but the bodies were too fast, too strong. It was like they were being pulled back into the crypt by some invisible force. As they were dragged deeper into the crypt, Samuel noticed something familiar. It was the same pair of glowing red eyes he had seen in the abandoned mental institution, only this time they were getting closer. They were surrounded, trapped, and alone. Samuel knew they only had one chance to escape, and it would require all the bravery they had left. They recited the ancient words, hoping it would be enough to ward off the darkness that was closing in. With each word, the air grew lighter, and the bodies retreated. They emerged from the crypt, gasping for breath, and saw a glimmer of hope. A light shone in the distance, and they knew it was the way out. Samuel and Emily ran, their feet pounding the ground as they headed towards the light. They knew they couldn't stop, not until they were safe. And then they were out. Back in the forest, the air clear and crisp. They collapsed, grateful to be alive. But they knew their journey wasn't over. The darkness was still out there, waiting for them. And they had no idea what was next. Chapter 94. Samuel and Emily ran towards the light, gasping for breath. But as they approached it, they realized it was coming from a burning building in the distance. They could hear the distant screams of people trapped inside. Without hesitating, they raced towards the flaming structure, intent on saving anyone they could. As they drew closer, Samuel could feel the heat of the flames on his skin and smell the acrid smoke filling his lungs. He stumbled on a piece of debris, nearly falling, but Emily caught him and pulled him back up. Together, they burst through the front door of the burning building, coughing and gagging on the thick smoke. Inside, they found a scene of utter chaos. People were running in every direction, their clothes smoldering and their faces twisted in fear. Some were trapped, screaming for help, while others were trying desperately to put out the flames with buckets of water. Samuel and Emily sprang into action, working to drag people to safety and put out the fire. They worked tirelessly, their bodies aching from the effort, but determined to save as many lives as possible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the flames began to die down and the last of the survivors were brought to safety. Samuel and Emily collapsed to the ground, exhausted but relieved. As they caught their breath, however, they realized that something was off. The air felt wrong, charged with a strange energy that sent chills down their spines. They looked around, searching for the source of the feeling. That's when they saw it. A figure, shrouded in darkness, lurking in the shadows of the burning building. Samuel's heart leapt into his throat as he realized what it was. A creature of the dark, come to haunt them once again. Chapter 95. Samuel and Emily gasped for air, their hearts racing as the creature's shadowy form slithered closer. It seemed to be made entirely of smoke and darkness, its eyes glowing red like the ones that Samuel had seen in the abandoned mental institution. "What do we do?" Emily whispered urgently. "I don't know," Samuel replied, his voice shaking. "We defeated the keepers of the dark, but this thing, it's something else entirely." The creature let out a low growl, and Samuel and Emily braced themselves for an attack. But instead of lunging at them, the creature seemed to be studying them, as if trying to decide whether they were worth its time. In the dim light, Samuel could make out the creature's features more clearly. It had long, spindly limbs and pointed ears that twitched as it listened for something. Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that it was intelligent, and that it was biding its time for some unknown reason. As they watched, the creature suddenly turned and darted away, disappearing into the darkness. Samuel and Emily were left alone, their hearts still pounding from the encounter. "We have to keep moving," Samuel said, his voice firm. "We can't let that thing catch us." Emily nodded, and they set off once again, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The forest was silent now, but Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They walked for what felt like hours, the tension in the air growing thicker with every step. And then, just as they were about to give up hope, they saw it, a flicker of light in the distance. Together they ran towards it, their hearts lifting with relief. As they drew closer, they could see that the light was coming from a small cabin nestled in a clearing. "Maybe there's someone inside who can help us," Emily said hopefully. Samuel nodded, and they approached the cabin cautiously. But as they drew closer, they realized that something was wrong. The door was hanging off its hinges, and there were signs of struggle all around. "Be careful," Samuel warned, his hand on the hilt of his sword. "Something's not right here." As they pushed open the door, they were hit by a wave of foul-smelling air. The cabin was a mess, with furniture overturned and blood smeared on the walls. And then they saw it, a figure slumped in the corner, surrounded by a pool of blood. Samuel and Emily exchanged a look. They knew what they had to do. Together, they stepped forward, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Chapter 96. Samuel and Emily stepped into the small cabin, scanning their surroundings with wary eyes. The air was thick with the smell of copper and decay, and thick cobwebs draped the walls and ceiling. The figure in the corner came into view. It was a man, slumped over and covered in blood. Samuel stepped forward to check for a pulse, but the man's body was cold and lifeless. "Who would do this?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Samuel scanned the room, his eyes falling on a nearby table. A stack of papers lay haphazardly on its surface, and he made his way over to inspect them. The papers were filled with strange scribblings and diagrams, scrawled in what appeared to be blood. Samuel's blood ran cold as he read the words, his mind reeling with disbelief. "Emily," he whispered urgently, "you need to see this." Emily joined him at the table, her eyes widening in disbelief. The papers described ancient rituals and incantations, the very same ones they had been using to defeat the creatures of the dark. "I don't understand," Emily said, her voice shaking. "Who would do something like this? Why would they use these rituals for such evil?" Samuel shook his head, unable to find an answer. They had stumbled upon something sinister, something that went far beyond their love for dark humor. As they continued to sift through the papers, they heard a low growling sound emanating from outside. Samuel and Emily tensed, their eyes darting towards the door. "We need to go," Samuel said urgently, stuffing the papers into his bag. "Now." They rushed out of the cabin, their hearts pounding with fear. The growling grew louder, and they could hear footsteps rapidly approaching. Suddenly, a dark figure lunged out of the trees and landed in front of them. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and its body rippled with smoke and darkness. It was the same creature that had been stalking them since they arrived. Samuel and Emily stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The creature studied them for a moment before speaking, its voice echoing through the forest. "Who are you?" it asked, its eyes darting between them. Samuel and Emily glanced at each other, unsure of what to say. "We're just travelers," Emily said hesitantly. The creature snorted, its body shifting restlessly. "Liars," it spat out. "You carry the stench of the dark with you. You are not welcome here." Samuel pushed Emily behind him, his fists clenched in determination. It was time to face the dark head-on, no matter the consequences. "We will not leave," he said firmly. "We will fight for what's right, no matter the cost." The creature bared its teeth, its eyes growing even brighter. Samuel and Emily braced themselves for the fight of their lives. Chapter 97. Samuel and Emily poised themselves for a fight, bracing for whatever the creature had in store for them. Its shadowy form loomed over them, its eyes glowing an ominous red. Samuel could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he stood his ground, ready to defend himself and Emily with everything he had. The creature let out a low growl, its form shifting as if trying to intimidate them. Samuel gripped his weapon tightly, sweat beading on his forehead as he prepared to make the first move. Suddenly, the creature lunged forward, its body twisting and contorting in an unnatural way. Samuel swung his weapon, hitting the creature square in the chest. To his surprise, the creature didn't dissolve into smoke like he'd been expecting. Instead, it recoiled a bit, its form flickering and wavering before it reasserted itself. Emily let out a gasp, her eyes widening in fear. Samuel could feel his own panic rising, but he forced it down, determined to protect them both. The creature lunged again, much more quickly this time. Samuel sidestepped, dodging the attack, but the creature was relentless. It kept coming, moving with impossible speed and agility. Samuel knew that he couldn't keep this up forever. He needed to find a way to defeat the creature once and for all, before it could do any more harm. Just as he was beginning to feel hopeless, something strange happened. The creature's form began to warp and twist, as if it was being pulled towards something. Samuel and Emily watched in awe as the creature was forcibly dragged away, its body disappearing into thin air. They stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Finally, Samuel spoke up. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice tight with worry. "Whatever that thing was, it's not safe for us to stay." Emily nodded, and they began to make their way back through the forest, their hearts pounding with fear and adrenaline. As they walked, Samuel couldn't help but feel that they were being watched. He turned around, scanning the trees for any sign of danger, but there was nothing there. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them, watching them with glowing red eyes. Chapter 98. Samuel couldn't shake the feeling of being watched since their encounter with the creature of the dark. He felt like it was constantly lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Emily tried to reassure him that it was all in his head, but even she couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled over them. As they walked through the dimly lit forest, Samuel's mind wandered back to the strange papers they had found in the cabin. The words and symbols on the pages were ancient and unfamiliar, but they had a powerful and ominous aura that made his skin crawl. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of evil they were dealing with. Suddenly, Emily grabbed his arm and pointed ahead. In the distance, they could see a flickering light and hear faint chanting. They cautiously made their way towards the source, their hearts pounding with fear and anticipation. As they got closer, the chanting grew louder, and they could make out the silhouette of a group of people gathered around a large bonfire. The people were all dressed in dark robes and their faces obscured by masks. They were chanting in a language that Samuel couldn't recognize, but the words had a menacing and sinister tone. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he realized that this was the Cult of the Dark. They had been warned about this group, but he never thought they would actually come face to face with them. Before they could turn and run, they were suddenly surrounded by the cult members. Their eyes glowed with an otherworldly intensity, and their chanting grew louder and more frenzied. Samuel and Emily felt a sense of overwhelming terror wash over them, and they braced themselves for the worst. The cult members closed in, their hands reaching out to grab them, but suddenly another figure emerged from the shadows. It was Vlad, the man they had met in the abandoned mental institution. He held the glowing crystal in his hand, and as he raised it towards the sky, a blinding light engulfed them all. When the light faded, Samuel and Emily found themselves in a different place entirely. They were in a dark and twisted realm, where the very fabric of reality seemed to be tearing apart. The cult members were nowhere to be found, and the only sound was the distant howling of some unspeakable horror. And then they heard it. A voice soft and seductive whispered in their ears. It promised them power and secrets beyond their wildest dreams, but warned them of the price they would have to pay. Samuel and Emily knew they had gone too far. They had dabbled in dark humor and twisted jokes, but now they were in over their heads. They had to find a way out of this nightmare, before it consumed them whole. Chapter 99. Samuel and Emily stood in the dark, twisted realm, unsure of what to do next. The seductive voice continued to whisper to them, promising them unthinkable power and knowledge. Vlad, who had transported them to this place, stood nearby, watching them with a curious expression. "We have to resist this," Emily said, her voice shaking. "This is not right." Samuel nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "But how do we resist it? It's so tempting." Vlad stepped forward, his eyes glinting in the darkness. You can resist it by trusting me, he said. I know how to fight the cult of the dark. I know their secrets. The seductive voice grew louder, urging Samuel and Emily to give in to its temptation. But Vlad's words seemed to cut through the fog of their fear and confusion. We'll do it, Samuel said, his voice determined. We'll trust you. Vlad smiled, and suddenly the darkness around them seemed to part like a curtain. They found themselves standing in a room filled with strange instruments and arcane symbols. Vlad led them to a stone altar in the center of the room, and handed them each a glowing crystal. These crystals will give you power, he said. But you must use them wisely. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from outside the room. Samuel and Emily spun around, their hearts racing. What was that? Emily said, her voice trembling. Vlad's expression grew dark. They've found us, he said. The cult of the dark is here. Samuel and Emily stood frozen for a moment, but then they remembered the crystals in their hands. They gripped them tightly, feeling the power coursing through their veins. Let's do this, Samuel said, his voice steely. They burst out of the room, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Chapter 100. Samuel and Emily stood firm, holding their glowing crystals tightly as the members of the cult of the dark surrounded them. The seductive voice from the dark realm echoed in their minds, urging them to join the cult and embrace the darkest parts of themselves. But Samuel and Emily knew that they couldn't give in. They had seen the horrors that this cult was capable of, and they refused to become a part of it. With a fierce determination, they unleashed the power of their crystals, casting beams of light that illuminated the twisted trees and eerie mist surrounding them. The cult members hissed and recoiled, their dark robes billowing around them. Vlad joined in the fray, wielding a wickedly sharp sword that glowed with an otherworldly aura. With their combined strength, they managed to push back the cult members and create a path to escape. As they ran through the twisted realm, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by something even darker and more dangerous than the cult. The seductive voice in his mind whispered promises of power and knowledge, luring him towards the shadows. But he resisted. He clutched his crystal tightly, feeling its warmth and power coursing through his body. He knew that he had to stay strong and focused, or risk being consumed by the darkness. Finally, they burst through a portal and fell into a heap on the ground. They were back in the abandoned mental institution, where it all started. Breathless and shaken, they looked around at each other, still holding their crystals tightly. They knew that this was only the beginning of their battle against the darkness, and that they would have to be stronger and braver than ever before to survive. Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, even now. But he also knew that they had each other, and that gave him the courage to face whatever horrors might come their way. Chapter 101. As Samuel and Emily made their way out of the twisted realm, they noticed something odd happening around them. The animals that they had seen along the way, which had previously been indifferent to their presence, were now following them in a single file. The birds, mice, and even snakes seemed to be moving with a sense of purpose, and Samuel couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. As they reached the edge of the realm, the animals stopped and formed a circle around the couple, watching as if waiting for something. Suddenly, the ground shook beneath their feet, and an enormous creature emerged from the darkness. It was a massive black wolf with piercing red eyes and razor-sharp fangs. It dwarfed the animals around it, and Samuel and Emily froze in terror. The wolf prowled forward, and Samuel braced himself for an attack. But as the wolf reached them, it stopped abruptly and looked up at the couple with its glowing red eyes. Samuel and Emily felt a strange energy emanating from the beast, as if it were communicating with them telepathically. Without warning, the wolf turned and disappeared back into the shadows. The animals around them began to disperse, as if their purpose had been fulfilled. Samuel and Emily looked at each other, both stunned and relieved that they had survived. As they made their way back to the outside world, they couldn't help but wonder what other horrors lurked in the darkness. But they also knew that they had each other, and their glowing crystals to protect them. They had faced the cult of the dark and emerged victorious, and they would face any other terrors together. For they were the lovers of dark humor, and nothing could stand in their way. You have been listening to Lovers of Dark Humor. Written by #Blink and Thomas Sheriff. Read for you by Mike. Published by #Blink and Rebellious Rebels LLC. Artwork by #Blink LLC.